The journey of the woman we are about to follow begins, as many others do, in a small, seemingly insignificant village, nestled within the vast and often unforgiving landscape. This is not a tale of kings or generals, nor of legendary heroes whose names would be written in the scrolls of history for all to remember. No, this is the story of someone much less conspicuous, a woman whose name has been lost to time, someone who might have lived a life not unlike yours or mine. Her story is one of anonymity, yet it is precisely this lack of recognition that gives it profound significance. For she is one among the countless ordinary villagers who found themselves swept up in the unstoppable tide of the Mongol Empire's rise. She was not a warrior, nor a noblewoman, but a simple person, going about her daily routines, quietly living a life that, like so many others, would never make it into the grand narratives of war or conquest. We start with her life before the Mongols arrived. Picture, if you will, the quiet simplicity of her world. Mornings spent kneading dough for bread, the sound of water splashing into a wooden bucket, the rhythmic scratch of a broom sweeping dust from the floor. Her day might have begun before the first light of dawn, much as yours might in a busy life. She would have heard the familiar calls of her neighbors, perhaps the laughter of children, the low murmur of gossip among women, the comforting sounds of a community bound together by shared routine. In this village, she was neither rich nor poor, just a face in the crowd, another piece of the mosaic of everyday life. Her world was small, and it was one she had learned to navigate with a kind of calm acceptance. The bread she baked, the water she fetched, the small pleasures of an embroidered cloth from a neighbor, these were the things that mattered most to her. Each action was a simple form of resistance against the greater forces of the world, a way to assert that, in some small way, she too could make her mark. Yet, even in this idyllic life, there was a creeping unease, a subtle feeling that something was coming, something that would change everything. Perhaps it was in the way the air seemed to grow heavier with the weight of rumors, whispers of distant riders or of strange smoke seen in the far distance. Some of the village elders dismissed these fears. They had seen trouble before and had lived to tell the tale. But still, the unease lingered, and the woman, like everyone else, knew that something had shifted. The world she knew was not as safe as it once seemed. For in the distance, a storm was brewing, a storm unlike anything they had ever known. The Mongols, with their swift horses and ruthless ways, were sweeping across the land, taking everything in their path. It was not an invasion in the traditional sense. No heralds blowing horns, no war drums beating in the distance. Instead, it was a quiet, relentless wave, sweeping across villages and towns with a precision that felt almost unnatural. The woman might have heard the distant sound of hooves, or perhaps the first cracks of arrows piercing the air. Maybe she heard the low, unsettling hum that filled the air just before the chaos began. It was too late to run, too late to fight. The Mongols had already arrived, and with them, the violence and destruction that would change everything. What happened next was a blur, a chaotic, terrifying rush of smoke and fire, of people screaming and running, of lives lost in the blink of an eye. There was no chance to hold on to what she had once known. The village, her home, was consumed by the flames of conquest. Her routine, her simple life, was swept away in an instant, reduced to nothing more than ash and rubble. It is here, in the middle of this destruction, that the true horror of the Mongol conquest is laid bare. The woman is not a soldier, nor a warrior. She is not a hero, nor is she anyone who could expect a chance to stand and fight. Instead, she is just another victim of war, one of many who would be forgotten by history, swallowed up by the vast machinery of empire. She is captured not because she was a target, but because, in the eyes of the Mongols, she was simply there. There was no honor or shame in her capture. It was just the way of the world, the way empires moved and the way lives were erased in the wake of conquest. Her capture was not personal. It was not an act of violence against her specifically. It was simply the way of things, an ordinary woman swept up in an extraordinary wave of destruction. It is in these moments, as she is dragged from the ruins of her village and her life is consumed by the Mongol war machine, that her anonymity becomes both a curse and a shield. She is not a queen to be paraded before a conquering king, nor is she a warrior to be honored for her strength. She is not even a nameless hero, remembered by the few who would still speak of her in whispered tones. She is just another face in the crowd, another body to be counted, another life reduced to a number in the annals of empire. But what she experiences, the fear, the pain, the helplessness, the loss, is not without meaning. For her story, though lost to history, is the story of so many others like her, swept away by the tides of history. The conquest of the Mongols was not a glorious, heroic tale. It was not a story of knights and battles, of high-born kings and generals. It was a tale of destruction, of lives upended, of entire villages and cultures erased. And yet, in the silence of that destruction, the woman's story still holds meaning. She is not forgotten entirely. Her life, her pain, and her endurance are the quiet echoes of countless others who lived through this terrible period. They too were ordinary people, whose names were never written in the history books, whose stories were never told. As the Mongol Empire moved across the land, swallowing everything in its path, the woman became just another piece of the machinery. She was not a hero, she was not a legend. She was a victim of a vast, unfeeling empire, one that saw her not as a person, but as a tool, a resource. Her anonymity, however, is what makes her story so powerful. For she is not just one woman. She is every woman, every man, every child who lived through this dark time. She is the voice of the many who were lost to history, whose stories were never told, whose names were never remembered. And as her story unfolds, we are reminded of the quiet, often overlooked lives that make up the fabric of history. In the grand sweep of time, it is easy to forget those who lived in the shadows, those who were swept away by the tide of conquest. But it is these people, the nameless, the ordinary, the forgotten, who form the heart of history. Their lives, though never chronicled, are the silent foundation upon which empires are built. The Mongol conquest, with all its violence and destruction, was not just a war fought on the battlefield. It was a war fought in the homes and hearts of ordinary people, people like the woman at the center of our story. Her life, her world, was turned upside down in an instant, and she became just another casualty in the vast, unfeeling machinery of empire. Yet, even in the midst of this destruction, her story is not without hope. For though she is anonymous, though she is lost to history, her experience is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Even when faced with the unrelenting forces of empire, even when her world is torn apart, she endures. She survives, not because of any great strength or heroic action, but simply because she is alive. She endures, and in her endurance, she becomes a symbol, not of glory or victory, but of the quiet strength that lies within us all, the strength to keep moving, even when the world around us is crumbling. And so, as we begin this journey into her story, let us remember that though she is but one woman, her life represents the lives of countless others who lived, loved, and endured in the shadows of history. Her anonymity is not a tragedy. It is a reflection of the many stories that have been lost to time, the quiet histories that are no less meaningful for their silence. In her story, we find the echo of our own lives, the quiet strength of the ordinary person, the forgotten hero. For even in the shadows, there is light. Even in the silence, there is a story worth telling. The sun had barely begun to stretch its golden fingers across the sky, casting long shadows on the earth, when her day started. Each day began not with the grand gestures of celebration, but with the quiet routines of life, routines so deeply ingrained in the fabric of her existence that they had become part of the very air she breathed. These were the hours before anyone else in the village had risen. The first light had not yet touched the treetops, and the world outside was still wrapped in the cool embrace of night, but her life had already begun in its own gentle, unremarkable way. The smell of bread dough filled the air as she worked her hands into the flour, a comforting texture that made the world feel safe and familiar. Kneading the dough was a rhythmic process, a dance of sorts that her hands had long since memorized. Each motion had its place, a fluidity that spoke to the years of practice, to the generations of women who had come before her, who had done the same. The dough, soft yet firm, folded under her fingers, a tactile reminder of the simple, timeless necessity of bread. She could feel the warmth of the flour against her palms, the way the dough responded to the pressure, and she knew that soon enough, she would be shaping it into loaves, each one a testament to the humble power of the earth, a gift that sustained her family day after day. The hearth was already crackling softly, a faint glow from the embers casting a low, orange light on the walls of her modest kitchen. She moved quickly but deliberately, pulling an iron kettle from the hook on the wall and setting it over the fire to heat water for tea. The scent of wood smoke mingled with the faintest trace of damp earth, the smells of a night just past, and of the day to come. She took a moment to breathe in the quiet, the peace of the world just before it awakened. The steady hum of morning birds and the distant lowing of cows outside signaled that the village was slowly stirring. Outside, the first stirrings of the village echoed through the cold air. The sounds of doors opening, children yawning, the soft shuffle of slippers against stone as neighbors began their own routines, filled the spaces between the homes. The narrow dirt paths between the huts became livelier as the day unfolded, a constant dance of human activity. The village was waking, just as she was, and there was comfort in the sameness of it all. The familiar sights and sounds of the world she knew, the cobbled paths, the simple wooden fences, the smoke rising from chimneys, marked the rhythm of the day. But inside her small home, there was no rush, no hurried movements. Everything had its place. Each task followed the next like an intricate, perfectly timed series of events. She placed the tea leaves into the pot with care, mindful of the right amount. She had always known just how much was needed, not too little, not too much, just enough to fill the air with that earthy, calming aroma as it steeped. The kettle began to hiss softly, signaling that the water was ready. She poured it into the pot, watching as steam curled up from the spout. The smell of the tea leaves and the hot water mixed in a comforting haze, and she allowed herself a moment to enjoy the warmth it brought. It was in these early hours, in the quiet solitude of morning, that she found her calm. There was a stillness here, a peacefulness that was unique to this time of day. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for the full force of life to begin. And for her, this stillness was necessary. The demands of the day would come soon enough, but for now, there was only the softness of morning and the steady, unhurried rhythm of her work. Outside the window, the children of the village began to stir. Their voices rose slowly, soft at first, and then louder as the sun climbed higher. The older children helped with chores, fetching water or tending to the animals, while the younger ones ran through the village, their laughter light and carefree, the air alive with the sound of their play. The goats bleated from the small pens nearby, and the roosters crowed from the chicken coop, signaling the start of the full day. Her work was not done yet. There was still bread to bake, water to carry, meals to prepare. The routine was a constant, and there was comfort in it. The bread was always the first thing on the list. Once the dough had risen, she shaped it into loaves, each one carefully crafted with the skill that had been passed down through generations of women. The scent of rising dough filled the room, mingling with the tea and the soft heat of the fire. The bread was placed in the oven, and she moved to the next task, fetching water. The well was located on the edge of the village, and though the journey was short, it was always a moment of quiet reflection. The wooden bucket hung from the rope, heavy with water, and she lifted it with practiced ease, the weight familiar in her hands. As she pulled it up from the depths of the well, she would pause for a moment, letting the cool breeze of the early morning wash over her. The landscape stretched out before her, fields dotted with wildflowers, the soft hills rolling in the distance. There was a beauty in the simplicity of this place, a beauty that she took for granted. The walk back to the house was brief but important. The quiet time with the water, the morning light filtering through the trees, the rhythm of the bucket swaying in her hands. It was time that allowed her to collect her thoughts and prepare herself for the day ahead. The village was waking, and soon enough, the sounds of the day would swell, voices calling from the fields, children playing in the streets, the animals that were always in motion. Back in her home, the tea was ready, the water just the right temperature. She poured herself a cup, the steam rising, and took a long sip. The warmth of the tea spread through her, a welcome comfort on the cool morning. There were no grand plans for the day, no great challenges or changes. It was simply another day, another cycle of life in the village. The day continued to unfold slowly, each task following the next with the same predictability. There was no rush here, no sense of urgency. The chores were part of the rhythm of life, and there was satisfaction in completing them well. Each task was a small victory, a contribution to the ongoing dance of village life. Whether it was feeding the chickens, tending to the garden, or preparing a simple meal, everything had its place. Everything was connected. Her life was not marked by grand events or sudden shifts, but by the quiet steadiness of everyday life. As the sun climbed higher, the village became more active. The sounds of neighbors calling to one another, the chatter of women as they worked together, the laughter of children playing in the streets, all of it filled the air, creating a hum of life. People moved through the streets with purpose, carrying baskets, tending to animals, and greeting one another as they went. It was a community in constant motion, but always in balance, always in harmony with the natural flow of the day. And yet, in the midst of all this, there was something quietly unsettling in the air, a sense that things were about to change. The villagers could feel it too, this subtle tension, a shift just beyond the horizon. The murmurs of fear that had begun to spread through the village, the rumors of strange riders on the plains, the unsettling quiet that had begun to settle in the evenings. It was the kind of thing that could be easily dismissed as nothing more than a passing worry, something to ignore as life continued its steady rhythm. But for her, as she moved through the motions of her day, something lingered in the back of her mind. A feeling that the world she knew, the world of simple tasks and routines, was somehow on the cusp of something bigger, something that would change everything. But for now, the morning was still hers. The bread was rising, the tea was hot, and the village was waking. There would be time for worry later, time for fear and uncertainty. For now, there was only the simple pleasure of a well-cooked meal, the satisfaction of a chore completed, and the deep, unspoken knowledge that this day, like all the others before it, would pass quietly until it didn't. In a world filled with the endless demands of survival, it was the small joys that made life bearable. These were the moments that allowed her to pause, to breathe, and to remember the simple beauty of being alive. They were not grand moments of achievement or triumph, but rather the fleeting, quiet instances of peace that could be found amidst the chaos of daily life. One such joy came in the form of an unexpected gift from a neighbor, an embroidered strip of cloth. It arrived on a morning much like any other, when the sun was just beginning to climb over the horizon, casting a soft golden light across the village. She had been busy with her usual chores, kneading dough for bread, heating water for tea, when the knock on the door came. It was an unassuming sound, the kind of knock that was easy to ignore, but she had learned long ago that the small things, the seemingly insignificant moments, often carried the greatest meaning. She opened the door to find her neighbor, an elderly woman who lived 2 houses down. The woman had a kind face, weathered by years of life but still full of warmth. She held out the small strip of cloth, her hands trembling slightly as she passed it over. It was a simple thing, no grand design or intricate pattern, but it was beautiful in its own way. The fabric was soft, woven with care, and the embroidery was delicate. Tiny flowers and vines stitched in pale thread. It was the kind of gift that didn't need to be explained. It spoke of love, of friendship, of shared history between neighbors. The woman took the cloth with a quiet sense of gratitude, her fingers brushing lightly over the embroidered flowers. It was a gesture of kindness, a reminder that even in the midst of the struggles of everyday life, there could still be beauty, still be moments of connection. She had not expected it, but there was something deeply comforting in the thought that someone had taken the time to create something so small, so simple, yet so meaningful. As she held the cloth, she found herself thinking about the neighbors she had known for years, the faces that had become as familiar as her own. The village was a small place, its people bound together by necessity and habit, but it was also a place where connections were woven in the quietest of ways, through small acts of kindness, through shared moments of life. And this cloth, this simple gift, was a reminder that these connections mattered, that they were the threads that held the fabric of the village together. She carefully folded the cloth and set it on the small table by the window, where it caught the morning light. It would not be put to any grand use. It was not a piece of fine cloth that would be turned into a dress or a pillow cover. It was, instead, a reminder. a reminder of the kindness that existed in the world, even in times when everything else seemed uncertain. It was a small joy, but it was enough. Enough to remind her that, even in a life marked by toil and routine, there could be moments of quiet beauty, moments that brought peace to the heart. The act of receiving the cloth was a quiet pleasure, but it was the moments that followed, the little rituals of the day, that brought her the most comfort. She did not need grand celebrations or loud displays of affection. What she needed, what she had always needed, was the small, steady rhythm of life. It was in these routines that she found her sense of peace. One such routine was the simple act of cleaning. Every morning, after the bread had been set to rise and the water had been brought in from the well, she would take up her broom and begin to sweep the floor. The motion was familiar, comforting, back and forth, each stroke of the broom sweeping away the dust and debris that had gathered over the night. It was a quiet task, one that required little thought, but it was also a task that brought a sense of order to the world. As she swept, she could feel the weight of the day's worries lift, if only for a moment. The world outside might be chaotic, might be filled with uncertainty, but here, in this small corner of the world, there was peace. The dust was swept away, the floor cleared, and for a brief moment, the world was as it should be. Cleaning was not just a task, it was a ritual. The motion of the broom was like a prayer, a small offering to the gods of order and simplicity. It was an acknowledgement that even in a life that often felt beyond control, there could still be small acts of control, small moments of peace. The world might not always make sense, but in this moment, with the broom in her hands and the floor beneath her feet, everything felt right. Next came the sorting of lentils, a task that, like cleaning, was repetitive, but oddly soothing. She would take the small, round grains in her hands, feeling their smooth texture as she passed them through her fingers. Each lentil was examined, checked for imperfections. The small, dark seeds that had been damaged or cracked were set aside, while the perfect, unblemished ones were placed into the bowl. It was a quiet, meditative task, one that allowed her to drift in thought while her hands worked. The lentils, once sorted, would be set aside for the evening's meal. There was something about the act of preparing food that grounded her, that connected her to the earth and to the generations of women who had come before her. The earth had provided these small grains, and in turn, she would use them to nourish her family, to continue the cycle of life that had existed for centuries. It was a quiet, humble act, but it was an act of creation, of turning the raw materials of the earth into something that could sustain and nurture. And then there was the act of combing her younger cousin's hair. This was perhaps the most intimate of her daily routines, a moment of connection that could not be replicated by any other task. Her cousin, younger by a few years, was a constant presence in her life, always nearby, always in need of care. The girl's hair was long and thick, and often tangled, a wild tangle of curls that needed gentle attention. Every evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the woman would sit beside her cousin, the two of them nestled into the corner of the small home. The flickering light of the fire cast shadows on the walls, and the soft crackling of the flames was the only sound that filled the space. She would take the wooden comb in her hand, running it through the tangled locks with slow, deliberate strokes. The motion was gentle, soothing, each pass of the comb a small act of love. The girl, content in her silence, would close her eyes, letting the rhythm of the combing calm her, like the steady beat of a drum. There was something deeply comforting about this simple act. It was a moment that allowed them to connect without words, without the need for explanation. The combing of her cousin's hair was a way to show care, to offer affection without expectation. It was a small joy, but it was a joy that had deep meaning. The quiet intimacy of it, the way the girl would rest her head on her shoulder, the trust she placed in her hands. It was a reminder that even in the simplest moments, there was love. And love, after all, was what made all of these small joys worthwhile. The gift of embroidered cloth from a neighbor, the sweeping of the floor, the sorting of lentils, the combing of hair, these were not just tasks to be completed. They were rituals of connection, moments that tied her to her community, to her family, to the earth itself. These small joys were the threads that wove her world together, keeping her grounded in the midst of the uncertainty that often surrounded her. As she looked at the cloth, now folded neatly on the windowsill, she knew that it wasn't just the gift itself that mattered. It was the thought behind it, the kindness, the care that had gone into creating something so small, so simple, yet so meaningful. In a world that often seemed overwhelming, it was these small moments, these small acts of care and love, that made everything else bearable. And so, life went on. The daily routines continued, each one a small joy in its own right. There were days of laughter and days of silence, days of work and days of rest. But through it all, the small joys remained. They were the steady rhythm of her life, the heartbeat of a world that, though uncertain, was still beautiful in its own quiet way. The air was thick with something unspoken, a quiet unease that seemed to hover just below the surface of daily life. It began like the faintest of whispers, carried on the wind, barely noticeable at first. But as the days passed, the whispers grew louder, carried on the tongues of villagers who spoke in hushed tones, glancing over their shoulders as they spoke. Something was happening. Something was coming, though no one knew exactly what. There was a fear in the air now, one that settled in the pit of the stomach, a gnawing feeling that wouldn't let go. It was as if the world had shifted, and no one knew how to stand in it anymore. It started near the river, where the land seemed to stretch endlessly, vast and open. One evening, a man who lived on the outskirts of the village came to the center, breathless, his face pale. He had seen something, he said. He had seen riders, unfamiliar men, strange men, far off near the riverbank. They had been moving fast, cloaked in dust and shadow, their forms barely visible in the haze of the setting sun. His words came out in a rush, his hands trembling as he tried to explain, but no one quite understood what he meant. Riders? Who could they be? Surely not strangers, not in this isolated part of the world. The river was a place of quiet, of solitude. No one passed through here without reason. But the man was insistent, his eyes wide with fear. And then came the stories from others. More sightings near the river, strange figures moving in the twilight, too many to ignore. Some spoke of seeing smoke, rising in the distance, curling into the sky like a whisper of something ominous. No one knew what it meant, but all agreed that something was wrong. Something that had not been there before, something that didn't belong. As the rumors spread, so did the unease. It was in the way people looked at one another now, their eyes darting to the edges of the village, scanning the horizon as if they were expecting something to appear at any moment. It was in the hushed conversations, the nervous glances exchanged between neighbors. The laughter of children in the streets became quieter, more tentative, as though even they could sense the shift in the air. There was a weight to the silence now, something that hadn't been there before. The elders tried to reassure everyone, of course. It's nothing, they said. Just rumors, just whispers. The river has always been a place for travelers, for traders. This is nothing to fear. Their voices were calm, steady, and yet there was a tightness in their words, a hesitation that betrayed their own uncertainty. They had lived through storms, through floods, through seasons of drought and hunger. But this was different. They could not explain it, could not place it. And so they told the villagers to remain calm, to carry on with their work, to hold on to the normalcy of their routines. But even as they spoke, their eyes flitted to the horizon, as though they too were waiting for something they could not name. The women went about their chores as they always did, but there was a difference now, an underlying tension in every movement. They swept the floors with less focus, their minds far away, their glances drifting to the road that led to the village. The children were sent out to play, but the laughter that once rang through the air now held an edge of uncertainty. Their games were quieter, their voices lower, as though they too were listening for something just beyond their hearing. The men tried to appear unshaken, gathering in the evenings to discuss the strange reports. Some of them spoke in low voices, voices that carried the weight of concern despite their efforts to appear calm. They talked about the sightings near the river, the figures that appeared on horseback in the distance. No one had seen them up close. No one could say who they were or what they wanted. But there were too many signs, too many oddities to ignore. The world was shifting, and they knew it. They felt it in their bones. Still, There was an effort to maintain the outward appearance of normalcy. The village's routine continued, though it was marked by an anxious energy. The bread was baked, the water fetched, the chores carried out as always, but now, there was something different in the air. There was a quiet sense of waiting. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt it. Something was coming. Something that could not be ignored. Something that would change everything. The rumors of danger were like the first whispers of a storm on the horizon. At first, they were easy to dismiss. After all, there were always rumors, always something in the air, always a hint of fear that drifted through the village on the winds. But as the days passed, the rumors grew louder, more persistent. And with each new story, each new sighting near the river, each new whisper of smoke on the horizon, the unease deepened. It wasn't just the river anymore. It was the whole world that seemed to be shifting, pulling away from its familiar orbit. The land felt less safe, less predictable. The things that had always been constant, the sun that rose each morning, the bread that rose in the oven, the familiar faces of neighbors and friends, were no longer enough to protect them. Something larger was coming. Something outside the village, outside their world. And they could feel it in the way the earth seemed to hum beneath their feet, the way the sky felt too wide, too empty. As the days passed, the villagers began to adapt to the new rhythm of fear. They still carried on with their routines, still lived their lives, but there was a heightened awareness now, a sharpness to everything they did. The women's hands, once so steady and sure as they worked, now trembled slightly as they folded laundry or tended the fire. The men's voices, once so firm and confident as they discussed the day's work, now held a certain hesitation, a flicker of doubt that hadn't been there before. They glanced over their shoulders as they walked, scanning the horizon as if the world had suddenly become unfamiliar. It wasn't just the rumors of strange figures by the river that unnerved them. It was the feeling of being watched, the sense that something unseen was out there, lurking just beyond the edge of the village. The village had always been a quiet place, a safe place. There were no wars, no battles, no armies marching toward them. Life was simple, predictable, routine. But now, the safety they had taken for granted was slipping away, replaced by the gnawing feeling that something was coming, something that they were not prepared for. It was a hard thing to name, the unease. No one could put their finger on it exactly. It wasn't the sight of a single rider or the smoke on the horizon. It wasn't one specific event, but 1,000 small signs. A strange sound carried on the wind, the unsettling quiet of the birds in the trees, the way the animals had begun to behave. It was the way the river, once a calm and steady force, now seemed more turbulent, more unpredictable. The current ran faster, stronger, as if it too was anticipating something, something that was just out of sight. And so, they waited. They tried to remain calm, to keep the routines of daily life intact. But the unease grew like a shadow that followed them everywhere, never leaving, always there. It was a waiting game now, a game in which no one knew the rules. No one knew what the outcome would be. All they could do was hold on, keep working, keep living, and hope that the storm they feared would pass them by. But deep down, they all knew, the storm was coming. And when it arrived, they would have no choice but to face it. The last normal night was, in many ways, like all the others that had come before it. The evening air was still and cool, the sky bathed in the soft, fading hues of sunset. The village, tucked away in the quiet corners of the world, seemed at peace, untouched by the restless whispers that had begun to stir in recent days. The daily rhythm had returned to its familiar, predictable pulse, children running home from their games, the smoke from hearths curling up into the darkening sky, the clink of metal as men sharpened their tools for the work ahead. All the signs of ordinary life were present, masking the unease that lingered just below the surface. And yet, there was something in the air that night, a subtle shift that no one could quite put their finger on. The world was quiet, almost too quiet, and though the evening looked as though it would pass without incident, there was a strange tension hanging in the air. It was the kind of feeling that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, that made you pause for a moment and wonder if everything was as it seemed. The first to sense it were the animals. The goats in their pens, usually so calm, began to stir restlessly, bleating sharply into the growing dark. It was an unsettling sound. There was a wildness to it, a frantic energy that was completely out of place for that time of evening. The dogs, too, barked incessantly, pacing back and forth near the edges of the village, their bodies taut with a nervous energy that hadn't been there before. The sheep huddled in tighter groups, and the cows shifted uneasily in their stalls, snorting in the quiet night. No one knew exactly what had caused it. Perhaps it was the distant sound of something unfamiliar on the wind, or maybe the way the air had begun to feel thick, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. The animals were restless, unsettled, and their reactions were enough to stir the villagers from their evening tasks. At first, the restlessness was easy to dismiss. It could have been nothing. A sudden gust of wind, perhaps, stirring the creatures into an uneasy frenzy. Or maybe it was just the darkening sky, the approaching night that made them nervous. But as the bleating continued, louder and more frantic, and the barking of the dogs grew more insistent, the sense of unease began to spread through the village like a creeping fog. In the quiet corners of homes, people paused in their tasks, glancing toward the door or the windows as if they too could sense something amiss. The familiar sounds of the village, of people calling to each other, of children playing in the street, of the low murmur of evening conversations, had become strained, muffled, as if the village itself was holding its breath. Even the wind, which had been soft and constant earlier in the day, seemed to have died down, leaving only the unsettling sounds of the animals in the distance. It was as though the world had fallen silent, waiting for something to happen. The villagers did their best to continue on with their routines. The women finished preparing dinner, though their movements were quicker, more hurried than usual. The children were called inside, their laughter cut short by the mounting tension that seemed to fill the air. The men stood in small groups, talking in hushed voices, casting uneasy glances toward the darkening landscape. Some of them tried to reassure the others, offering explanations for the animals' behavior, but their words were more to convince themselves than anyone else. Deep down, they too felt the growing sense of something unnameable, something that was creeping closer, just beyond the horizon. The first rays of light were barely visible as she ran to the window, her pulse quickening. She could see it now, figures moving quickly in the early morning haze, silhouetted against the rising sun. At first, they appeared like shadows, indistinct forms moving across the village with terrifying precision. They were fast, too fast, riding on horseback, their forms low and quick, almost ghost-like as they cut through the village with an efficiency that made her heart race. It wasn't just the speed that unsettled her, it was the stillness. The attackers didn't shout. They didn't make noise. They moved as though they had already won, already taken control of the village before anyone had a chance to react. It was the quietness that struck her the most. The riders swept through the village, their arrows loosed before they were even seen, their horses moving swiftly, low to the ground. It was as though they had been here before, as though they knew exactly what to do. The village was not a battlefield, it was a chore, a task to be completed swiftly, efficiently. The woman barely had time to react before the first wave of attackers reached her home. She heard the heavy thud of hooves pounding on the dirt road, followed by the shrill sound of someone shouting. The door to her home was suddenly flung open, and she barely had time to scramble away as two dark figures entered, their faces hidden beneath the hoods of their cloaks. She felt her heart stop as one of them grabbed her by the arm, yanking her to her feet. The force was overwhelming, the grip unyielding. In the chaos of the attack, there was no time for anything but survival. There were no demands, no offers of mercy. There was no reasoning with these invaders, no time to plead for safety. They were not here to negotiate. They were here to conquer, to claim everything in their path. The village, with its simple homes, its quiet streets, its peaceful existence, was nothing more than an obstacle in their way. As she was pulled out of her home, her mind raced. She heard the sounds of screams in the distance, the desperate cries of people who had been caught off guard, who had been taken by surprise. The village, which had once felt so safe, was now consumed by the chaos of the invasion. The air was thick with smoke, the smell of burning wood and straw filling her lungs as she was dragged through the streets. The buildings that had once felt so familiar, so solid, were now nothing more than structures to be destroyed. The attackers were everywhere. She saw them on horseback, moving quickly through the village, their swords flashing in the dim morning light. They moved with deadly precision, sweeping through the streets, cutting down anyone who dared to resist. There was no hesitation, no mercy. The villagers, unarmed and unprepared, were swept aside with terrifying efficiency. The invaders were not here to fight, they were here to win. And they knew exactly how to do it. As she was dragged along by the arm, she glanced over her shoulder, her eyes catching sight of the destruction unfolding behind her. The eastern gate of the village was already gone, replaced by a thick black cloud of smoke. She could hear the crackling of fire, the sound of that unearthly tearing, as buildings crumbled under the onslaught. The village was being consumed, burned to the ground, while she was swept away in the wake of the invaders' relentless advance. The noise was deafening now: hooves, screams, the crackling of fire, the clash of metal. She barely registered the words of her captors as they shouted orders to each other, their voices sharp and cold. She felt her body go numb, her mind overwhelmed by the sights and sounds of destruction. There was no escape. There was nowhere to go. And then, with one final, sickening pull, she was thrown to the ground, her breath knocked out of her as her captor's hands gripped her roughly. She looked up, her eyes wide with terror, but there was no one to help her. There was only the invasion, this force that had come out of nowhere, this force that had consumed everything she had known. As she lay there, gasping for air, the last remnants of her peaceful world crumbled away. She could hear the cries of the others, the helpless wails of those who had been caught, the sounds of their lives being torn apart. She had heard the rumors, felt the growing unease, but nothing could have prepared her for this. The village she had known was no more, its peaceful existence swallowed by the violent storm of conquest. And now, like the others, she was a part of it, a prisoner in a world that had been turned upside down. The destruction was swift, unrelenting, and in its wake, only silence remained, a silence that would be filled with the screams of the captured, the desperate cries of those who had not been so fortunate. And as the village was torn apart, the woman knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The world she had known was gone, replaced by something far darker, far more terrifying. And her place in it had already been decided. The chaos that followed was swift and absolute. One moment, there was the quiet of early morning, the kind of stillness that accompanies the first rays of sunlight, and the next, the world was engulfed in destruction. The village, which had once been a peaceful, bustling corner of the world, now seemed to be falling apart under the weight of an invisible hand. The sounds of hooves had barely stopped echoing when the first flames began to rise, curling in the air, licking at the rooftops of houses as the attack reached its deadly crescendo. It began in the distance, the thin, sickening scent of smoke creeping over the landscape, carried by the wind. It was faint at first, a wisp that could easily be ignored, but then, the fires ignited with terrifying force. The crackle of flames spread quickly, the air turning thick with ash as the fire leapt from house to house. The sky, once a pale blue with the promise of day, darkened under the smoke. It was as if the sun itself had been consumed by the inferno, the light turning red, orange, and black. The flames climbed higher, racing toward the heavens, consuming everything in their path. The village, which had been a safe haven, was now a place of utter devastation. The familiar smells of breakfast, of tea and fresh bread, were replaced by the pungent odor of burning wood and leather. The air tasted bitter, acrid. The fire spread with unnatural speed, fanned by the winds and stoked by the relentless force of the attackers. It wasn't just the buildings that burned. It was the sense of safety, the very foundation of their lives, crumbling before their eyes. Screams broke the silence next, the high-pitched cries of men, women, and children, mingling with the roar of the flames. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the walls of the houses, rising from the streets, piercing through the thick smoke. It was a sound of utter panic, a sound of lives torn apart in an instant, of everything familiar being reduced to nothing. People ran in every direction, some desperately trying to gather their belongings, others simply trying to escape the encroaching fire. The young and the old alike were caught in the chaos, their movements frantic, uncoordinated. And then came the Mongols, their figures appearing in the streets like ghosts, moving with a precision that was both terrifying and surreal. They rode low, their horses moving with practiced ease through the smoke-filled village, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods. Their bows were raised before they were even seen, their arrows loosed with deadly accuracy before the villagers even had time to react. The first few strikes were quick, sharp, silent, arrows that pierced the air, finding their marks with frightening efficiency. The chaos was not the result of a traditional battle. There were no war cries, no drums, no massive clashes of sword against shield. The Mongols didn't need such things. There was no need for dramatic gestures, no need to show their might in any overt way. They moved through the village like a tide, flowing with purpose, their movements orchestrated in a way that suggested they had done this countless times before. This was not a battle. It was a chore, a task to be completed with the precision of a well-oiled machine. They moved quickly, systematically, with no hesitation, no emotion. The Mongols didn't stop to revel in their conquest. They didn't pause to gloat over their victories. Every action, every move, was part of a larger plan, part of a routine they had mastered over years of conquest. The village, with its thatched roofs and small stone houses, was just another stop along the way, another obstacle to be removed. The attackers struck with a kind of clinical efficiency, as though they had no real interest in the villagers themselves, but only in the act of conquest. The Mongols moved through the streets, their horses galloping low to the ground, their eyes scanning the village with the cold, unfeeling precision of soldiers who had long since shed any notion of mercy. They didn't pause to kill every person they encountered. There was no need for that. Instead, they moved with the swift, unfeeling precision of a machine, taking only what they needed. People were captured, houses burned, livestock taken, but there was no unnecessary violence. It was as if the Mongols had perfected the art of destruction, the art of war, into something that was as efficient as it was terrifying. The woman, caught in the maelstrom of it all, could barely comprehend what was happening around her. The sight of the Mongols moving with such unyielding efficiency was almost surreal. They didn't hesitate. They didn't show pity. They simply took what they wanted, discarded the rest, and moved on. She saw one of the Mongols, a tall figure with a face partially obscured by a leather mask, swing his bow to the side and loose an arrow with deadly precision. It struck a man in the chest before he even had time to draw breath, his body crumpling to the ground without so much as a sound. The Mongol didn't even slow down. He simply rode past the man's body, his eyes never leaving the village ahead of him, never acknowledging the destruction he had wrought. There was no sense of victory in the Mongol's eyes, no hint of pride. It was as though he was simply following an order, performing a task that had been laid before him. Another Mongol rode through the village, this one with a sword raised high, slicing through the air in a smooth, practiced motion. He moved through a cluster of villagers who had gathered at the center, slashing quickly at anyone who came too close. There was no great clash of steel, no drawn-out battle. He moved swiftly, almost methodically, cutting down anyone who presented a threat with minimal effort. It was efficient. It was terrifying. It was a reminder of how thoroughly the Mongols had mastered their craft. In the midst of all this, the woman found herself swept along, caught in the current of panic and confusion. She tried to run, to escape, but her legs felt as though they were made of stone, weighed down by the gravity of what was happening around her. She could hear the screams of the other villagers, the sounds of terror and desperation, as they were driven forward by the Mongols' relentless assault. Some tried to fight, but it was useless. The Mongols didn't need to engage in prolonged combat. Their efficiency meant that the battle was already over before it had even begun. The villagers, unarmed and untrained in the ways of war, stood no chance. There was no mercy in this assault. The Mongols didn't spare the old or the young. They didn't hesitate to cut down anyone who was in their path. The woman saw an elderly man, his hands shaking as he tried to make his way to the relative safety of a house, only to be struck down by a swift, precise blow from a Mongol sword. There was no time for mourning, no time for grief. The Mongols didn't pause to see if their victims were worthy of death. They simply took what they needed and moved on. The fire spread faster now, fueled by the terror and destruction, its flames casting long shadows across the village. Buildings collapsed under the force of the fire, their timbers cracking and splintering as they succumbed to the flames. The village, once a home filled with life and routine, was now nothing more than a smoldering ruin. The smoke billowed high into the sky, thick and black, a darkened cloud that marked the village's fate. The Mongols moved through it all with impassive detachment, their work methodical, their actions precise. There was no chaos in their movements, no hasty decisions. Everything they did was deliberate, measured. The village was not a battlefield to them. It was simply a task to be completed, and they had done this task countless times before. As the woman stumbled through the smoke-filled streets, she realized that there was no place left to hide. The village, once a place of safety, had been reduced to rubble, its inhabitants scattered or caught in the deadly grip of the Mongols' efficiency. There was no more escape. The world had shifted, and in the wake of the Mongol assault, there was nothing left to hold on to. And so, the woman was carried along, caught in the ruthless momentum of the invasion, her village, her life, consumed by the relentless, devastating efficiency of the Mongols. The flames roared higher, the screams grew fainter, and the village, once so full of life, became nothing more than a memory, swallowed up by the fury of a conqueror who knew no hesitation, no mercy. The air was thick with smoke, heavy and acrid, making it hard to breathe. The once familiar scent of the morning, fresh earth, wood, the light smell of bread baking, was now replaced with the bitter stench of burning timber and the unmistakable metallic tang of blood. The world around her was no longer recognizable. The village that had been a sanctuary for her, a place where every corner was tied to a memory, was now a crumbling, chaotic nightmare. The woman's heart was pounding, her breath shallow and quick as the realization set in. Everything she had known was slipping away. She had to get out. She had to escape. But as the sounds of destruction reached their crescendo, the screams of the wounded, the roar of the fire, the unearthly shrieks of terror, her body went into a kind of automatic panic. Her legs, already heavy with fear and fatigue, seemed to move of their own accord. Her eyes frantically scanned the scene, but all she could see was the chaos, the fire licking at the edges of her vision, the shadows of the Mongols riding past with terrifying precision, their faces unreadable beneath their hoods. There was no safety to be found here. She needed to find her cousin. She needed to get away. The last shred of calm she had left shattered when she spotted her cousin, young, no older than 12, running in the opposite direction. Her dark hair flew behind her, her face pale with fear. The girl was fast, but the streets were clogged with panic-stricken villagers, some of them falling, some of them trying to fight, some of them simply running in random directions, hoping to escape the inferno that was quickly devouring their home. The woman shouted her cousin's name, her voice hoarse from the smoke. But the din of destruction drowned out her cries. The confusion of it all, smoke billowing in every direction, the desperate cries of the village filling the air, the screeching of horses' hooves against the dirt, made it impossible to hear anything clearly. For a moment, she thought she saw her cousin looking back, her eyes wide with fear, but the moment passed so quickly that it seemed like a dream. Her cousin was too far ahead now, disappearing into the haze of the village's collapse. In a heartbeat, the woman's instincts took over. She pushed forward, her feet stumbling over the uneven ground, dodging debris as the smoke grew thicker. The heat from the fire was unbearable now, the very air shimmering with the intensity of the flames. She could feel the fire's heat on her skin, could smell the burning of thatch and wood as the village seemed to implode around her. The ground beneath her feet was no longer solid. It was soft with the ash and debris, the streets slick with the remnants of destruction. Her heart raced as she neared the spot where she had last seen her cousin, but the chaos was overwhelming. Villagers were running, children were crying, and the Mongols, those silent, terrifying figures, were sweeping through the streets, cutting down anyone who dared stand in their way. Their movements were smooth, effortless, as though they were simply completing a task, not engaged in a violent invasion. The woman's pulse quickened as she pushed through the crowd, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had to find her cousin. There was no time to think, no time for hesitation. As she reached a narrow alley, she stumbled, nearly losing her footing as she caught a glimpse of her cousin in the distance. The girl was still running, but now she was being pursued. A Mongol had spotted her. The woman's heart skipped a beat. No, not her cousin. Desperation surged through her, propelling her forward. She called her cousin's name again, louder this time, but the sound was swallowed by the chaos. Her legs burned with the effort, and her feet slipped against the wet, debris-filled ground. She reached the end of the alley just as the Mongol moved toward her cousin, his face shadowed under the hood of his cloak, his eyes cold and unfeeling. The woman could see the fear in her cousin's eyes, the frantic, panicked look that reflected her own. The Mongol didn't hesitate. He reached for the girl, grabbing her roughly by the arm and yanking her off her feet. The woman's stomach dropped. She had to act. She couldn't let them take her cousin. She rushed forward, throwing herself at the Mongol with everything she had. But she wasn't fast enough. The Mongol turned his horse sharply, and the woman found herself face to face with the cold, calculating eyes of her captor. He didn't even flinch. One swift motion, and he raised the hilt of his sword, knocking her back with such force that she was thrown to the ground. Her breath was knocked from her chest, and for a moment, she lay there, gasping, trying to regain her senses. When she looked up, the Mongol was gone. Her cousin was gone. She could barely comprehend what had just happened. Her world had spun into chaos so quickly that she couldn't keep up. The street was empty, save for the lingering figures of the Mongols, moving smoothly through the destruction, like shadows on the edge of the smoke. Her mind raced. She had to find her cousin. She had to get to her before it was too late. She pushed herself up, ignoring the sharp pain in her side from where the Mongol's blow had struck her. The village was falling apart around her, but that didn't matter. All that mattered was her cousin. She had to find her. She couldn't lose her. But the village was collapsing, and it was happening so quickly that she was left with no clear direction. The streets, once so familiar, now seemed like a maze of confusion, of fire and smoke and the overwhelming noise of destruction. The buildings that had once stood solid, sturdy, were now little more than burning husks, their timbers cracking and splintering as the fire consumed everything. The smell of smoke was unbearable, the thick haze making it impossible to see more than a few feet in front of her. She could barely breathe, could barely move through the thick smoke, but she kept going, blindly searching for any sign of her cousin. She tried to move through the village, trying to catch glimpses of familiar faces in the chaos, trying to hear the sound of her cousin's voice. But the village was a blur, fire, smoke, and confusion all melding together. The screams of the villagers were constant, punctuated by the sharp, terrifying sound of the Mongols' hooves, their figures cutting through the smoke like grim reapers, hunting their prey with ruthless efficiency. At one point, she caught sight of a group of villagers, huddled together, trying to flee the fire. She pushed through them, her hands trembling as she searched for her cousin. But there was no sign of her. The woman's chest tightened with panic. She couldn't stop now. She had to keep moving, had to keep searching. The collapse of the village was happening all around her, the heat of the flames unbearable, the smoke so thick that she could barely see where she was going. The ground beneath her feet was now a mix of mud and ash, debris scattered in every direction. It was like walking through a nightmare, a place that no longer made sense, where every corner she turned brought her no closer to her cousin. Her thoughts were scattered, jumbled with fear and frustration. She couldn't breathe properly anymore. The air was too thick with smoke, the heat too intense. But she kept going, driven by a single thought, the need to find her cousin, to make sure she was safe. And yet, as the village continued to burn, as the chaos spread, it became increasingly clear that there would be no escape, no sanctuary. The Mongols had already won. The village was lost. There was no place left to run to, no place left to hide. The woman had been swept into the current of destruction, and there was no way to turn back. In the end, all that was left was the smoke, the fire, and the deafening silence that followed. The village that had once been her home was now nothing more than a smoldering ruin, a place of memories lost in the flames. And she, alone, was left to survive in a world that had already turned its back on her. The escape, like the village, had crumbled away, leaving only the remnants of a life that could never be reclaimed. The air was heavy with the scent of dust and smoke, a sharp tang that lingered in my throat. I remember how the quiet hum of the wind seemed to vanish, replaced by the thunderous, terrifying sound of hoofs pounding across the earth. My heart pounded in my chest, as if it, too, had become a part of that terrifying rhythm. The ground beneath me trembled, shaking with the weight of hundreds of soldiers who were fast approaching. But there was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. In that moment, I had no idea what would happen next. One moment, I was in the safety of my home, and the next, I was thrust into a chaos I couldn't comprehend. I remember the rough hands that grabbed me, pulling me out of my place in the crowd. Their grip was unyielding, cruel, like iron claws digging into the softness of my arms. I struggled, but there was no escape. The air around me felt like it was being sucked out, leaving me gasping for breath. A cloth, coarse and bitter, was shoved into my mouth. I could taste the dirt, the sweat of the hands that held me. It was the first time I truly realized how fragile my body was, how easily it could be broken, controlled, and silenced. I could hardly breathe. Every inhalation felt like a fight, as the cloth twisted deeper into my mouth. My eyes were wide, filled with fear and confusion. I couldn't scream. I wanted to, but the gag in my mouth, the terror in my chest, made it impossible. I could see the others around me, too, their faces twisted in panic, their bodies fighting back, but it was all in vain. We were powerless. Then came the bindings. Rough ropes, cutting into my skin, twisted around my wrists, forcing my arms behind my back. The pain was sharp, immediate. They bound us all in silence, a silence so thick it almost seemed like the earth itself had held its breath. The only sound that filled the air was the clinking of metal armor and the soft grunts of those who held us. The Mongols, I had learned, used fear like a weapon, more deadly than any sword. In their world, it wasn't just the strength of the body that mattered, it was the strength of the mind. As we were dragged from the place that had been home, I could feel my heart sinking deeper with each step. We were no longer people. We were captives, mere objects to be moved and controlled. The humiliation and terror were more unbearable than the rough tug of the ropes, the burn of my skin, the aching in my legs. The world felt like it was closing in around me, suffocating me. I couldn't tell where we were going or what awaited us, but in that moment, it didn't matter. It was the realization that, for the first time in my life, I was completely at the mercy of someone else. I had no power, no safety, nothing to hold on to but the fleeting hope that somehow, by some miracle, I might survive. The Mongols didn't speak to us. They didn't need to. Their eyes alone were enough. There was no kindness in them, no understanding. Just a cold, unyielding stare that told us everything we needed to know. We were not meant to survive. We were meant to be feared, broken, and used. The terror was inescapable. We were pushed forward, each of us herded together like livestock, our feet dragging across the dirt as we stumbled. I don't know how long we walked like that. Time seemed to stretch and twist in a way that felt unnatural. My body ached, my throat burned from the gag, and my mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. I was no longer a daughter, a sister, a woman with a name. I was just a prisoner, one among many. And all the while, I couldn't help but wonder, how many others had been through this? How many had felt this crushing weight of helplessness, the sting of being stripped of everything you once knew? Had they felt it too? Or had they succumbed to the fear and cruelty that seemed to permeate everything the Mongols touched? There was no way to answer that question, no way to understand it fully. All I knew was the pain, the fear, and the overwhelming sense of helplessness as we were dragged further away from the life we once knew. The day the Mongols came to our village, I was tending to the garden, pulling weeds from the soil, and feeling the warmth of the early afternoon sun on my skin. It was the kind of day where the air smells of earth and green, where the worries of the world feel distant, and life moves at a pace known only to those who live close to the land. The wind that brushed my face was soft, like a familiar touch, and in the distance, I could hear the quiet hum of the river, a constant companion to our days. I remember that moment vividly. I was just turning back to the house, my hands still dusty from the soil, when the first distant sound reached my ears. It was faint at first, almost like the rolling of thunder, but it wasn't thunder, it was something far worse. The sound of hooves, countless hooves, pounding against the earth. It wasn't just the sound of one or two riders. No, it was an army that was making its way toward us, and we were powerless to stop it. Fear did not come immediately. At first, there was a strange, still silence in me, a sort of disbelief that something like this could happen so suddenly. I had heard of the Mongols before. Their name, spoken in hushed whispers, carried tales of terror, of entire villages wiped from the face of the earth in a single night. But it was something that always seemed distant, something that happened to other people, not to us. Not to me. Not to my home. But as the thunderous sound of hooves grew louder, a sharp, cold sense of reality began to take hold. I dropped the basket I was holding, my breath catching in my chest. There was no time to flee, no time to gather my thoughts. My feet moved of their own accord, carrying me toward the house, toward the safety of our walls. But the doors never opened. The first Mongols came into view, their faces hardened with cruelty, their eyes cold with the promise of violence. They were upon us within moments, their figures blurring together like a storm. Their horses reared, kicking up the dust as they surrounded the village. I could see their weapons, long swords and arrows glinting in the sun. And before I knew it, the village I had known all my life, our peaceful haven by the river, was shattered, torn apart by the screams of those around me. The terror came next. The terror that hit me like a slap to the face. I was grabbed roughly by the arm, my body jerked from its place, and I was pulled into the chaos. The noise was overwhelming, a cacophony of shouting voices, the sound of metal clashing against metal, the screams of women, children, men, anyone unlucky enough to be in their path. I couldn't make sense of it. It felt like a nightmare, a horrible dream I could not wake from. I struggled, pulling against the grip that held me, but the Mongol soldier's hand was firm, unyielding. His fingers tightened around my wrist, and for a moment, I feared that my bones might snap beneath his force. But there was no time to react. He threw me to the ground, hard against the earth, and for a moment, everything went dark. My mind, clouded by panic, couldn't understand what had just happened. I heard voices above me, speaking in a language I did not understand. Their words were harsh, foreign, sharp like the points of their arrows. Then, before I could grasp what was happening, I felt the cruel bite of rope around my wrists, pulling my arms behind me, binding me in a tight, painful knot. The binding was cruel, far too tight. I couldn't move. I couldn't fight back. And in that moment, I realized something that took the breath right from my chest. I was completely vulnerable. The Mongols weren't interested in mercy. They didn't care for pleas or cries. Fear was their weapon, and it was a weapon they wielded with deadly precision. I could feel the weight of their gaze on me as they took me and the others, shoving us into lines, dragging us from our homes like cattle. It was a feeling I can never forget. The cold realization that nothing about my life would ever be the same again. The journey to their camp was long, though I remember little of it clearly. I was half dragged, half carried by the soldiers, my feet stumbling over the uneven ground. The ropes around my wrists cut into my skin, and every step sent a wave of pain through my shoulders. The air was thick with dust, the sun relentless against my skin, but it was the fear that consumed me. It settled in my chest, tightening with each step. Around me, I could hear the muffled sobs of other captives, women and children, their voices broken by the harshness of their treatment. We were all bound, all powerless. I felt the weight of their despair, and it felt as though the very earth beneath me was pressing down, a reminder of how small and insignificant we all were in the face of this overwhelming force. As we were marched onward, the Mongols spoke to each other in their harsh tongue, their voices like thunderclaps. They would laugh at our terror, at our helplessness. One soldier would push us forward with a cruel shove, while another would laugh, mocking our fear. It was as if our suffering was nothing to them, just another part of their conquest, another tool to break us down. By the time we reached their camp, my legs were sore, my body trembling from exhaustion and fear. But the worst was yet to come. I was thrown to the ground once again, this time before a large tent where the Mongol leaders gathered. Their eyes were cold, like stone, and they watched us with a detachment that sent chills down my spine. The soldiers stood at attention, their faces expressionless, as if they had done this 1,000 times before. And perhaps they had. To them, we were nothing but spoils of war. There, I finally understood the extent of their cruelty. They had no need for words to intimidate us. They had fear, and that fear was enough. It was all they needed. The soldiers did not need to speak. Their presence alone was enough to silence us, to strip us of any hope we might have had left. They moved among us like shadows, tall and menacing, their every movement deliberate and calculated. We were mere objects to them, nothing more than prizes to be claimed. The thought of escape was impossible. The ropes around my wrists felt like chains, heavy and suffocating. And then there was the fear, always the fear. It was all-encompassing. It was a weight that pressed against my chest, that robbed me of my strength, of my will to fight back. What could I do? What could any of us do in the face of such power? The Mongols used our fear like a tool, like a weapon. They knew how to break us, how to make us feel small, insignificant. I remember staring at the ground, the earth beneath me cold and hard. I could feel the weight of the soldiers' eyes on me, the pressure of their gaze making it harder to breathe. I tried not to think of what would come next, but the fear, that crushing fear, was always there, gnawing at me from the inside. I tried to hold on to something, anything, that would remind me of who I was, of where I came from. But everything seemed so far away, so distant now. The cruelty of the Mongols wasn't just in their physical strength. It was in how they used fear to control us. They didn't need to speak. They didn't need to raise their voices. All they had to do was move, and we would fall in line, driven by the terror they instilled in us. It was a fear that broke us down, that made us forget our humanity, that made us believe we were nothing more than the next victim in their endless march of conquest. And so we stayed there, in that cold camp, bound and broken, surrounded by the ever-present sound of Mongol voices, their laughter echoing in the distance. The fear never left us, not even when night fell, and we were forced to sleep in the dirt, under the cold, indifferent stars. It was then that I understood the true nature of the Mongol army, not just its strength, but its mastery of fear. They used it to break us, to mold us into what they needed. And for the first time, I felt the crushing weight of my own vulnerability. There was no escape. There was only survival. As the days stretched on, I would learn that this was not the end. Not for me nor for the others who had been taken. Our bodies were bound, our spirits broken, but something deep inside me refused to give up. Though the Mongols had taken everything from us, there was still one thing they could not control: our will to survive. The world had already blurred into something unrecognizable by the time we reached the Mongol camp. There was no sense of time anymore, no sense of how long we had been walking, no way to mark the passing days except by the gnawing hunger that had settled in my gut and the parched feeling in my throat. The sun blazed down mercilessly, but all of it, the heat, the exhaustion, the fear, felt distant. In that moment, we were little more than bodies moving through space, no longer human in the eyes of those who had captured us. As we were pushed into the heart of the camp, something strange and deeply unsettling began to take shape. The soldiers had a manner about them, a way of moving, that suggested they saw us not as individuals, not as people, but as a mere collection of bodies. There was no regard for names, no interest in who we were, where we came from, or what we had once been. We were nothing more than cattle, herded into a pen, our fates decided not by our own actions, but by the whims of men who had no care for our humanity. The soldiers' commands were sharp, harsh, and completely devoid of any empathy. They ordered us to stand in long, tight rows, our faces lowered, our bodies trembling from fatigue. My wrists, still bound by the ropes, burned from the strain. I tried not to cry out, to remain as still as possible, but there was nothing left in me but the hollow fear of what was to come. And still, no one cared. Not the soldiers, not the other captives. We were no longer seen for who we were, only for what we were: prisoners, broken and weak, to be sorted as the Mongols saw fit. I watched in silence as the soldiers moved among us, their hands cold as they grabbed men and women alike, pulling us into groups. The men were separated from the women and children, their fates marked out by the simple wave of a hand, a casual motion that decided so much. The women were herded together, their bodies pressed tightly, while the men were pushed to one side, away from us. The children were barely noticed, shoved into small groups without any real care. It didn't matter if you were old or young, strong or weak. You were simply moved, divided, sorted, nothing more than another body to be counted. I could feel the panic rising in me, the sense of powerlessness creeping back into my bones. It was as if I were no longer a person. There was no thought, no recognition that I had once been a daughter, a sister, a friend. We were all nameless now, just another part of a mechanical process that had no room for the soft, tender things that once made us human. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry out, to remind them that we were not just bodies to be moved. But what would have been the use of it? What good would it have done to remind them that I was more than a prisoner, more than just a tool in their war? There was a moment, just before they finished their sorting, that I looked around and noticed something truly terrifying. There was no protection. There were no guards for us, no safety to be found within the camp. The Mongols, for all their cruelty, had no interest in our well-being. They had no need to protect us. We were here for one reason only, to be used, to be bent into whatever shape they desired. And I understood, then, with a sudden, stark clarity, that there was no safety here, no sanctuary from the storm that had carried us into this world of chaos. I felt the full weight of my vulnerability then, the realization that there was no one here to protect us from what came next. The soldiers moved about their tasks, indifferent to our fear, to our pain, and I knew, deep in my bones, that they were not our captors, they were our executioners. Not by death, not immediately, but by the complete stripping away of everything that made us who we were. It was not the threat of physical violence that would break us. It was the crushing weight of knowing that our very identities had been erased. What struck me hardest was the realization that we were not the first to suffer in this way, nor would we be the last. The Mongol army had done this before, countless times, and they would do it again. To them, we were disposable, our lives of no more value than the animals they herded. They had come for our land, our homes, and they took what they wanted without hesitation. They had no need for empathy, for kindness, for any understanding of the people they destroyed. We were simply in their way, and that was enough to justify everything. The days that followed were filled with more of the same. A monotonous, endless routine of being moved from one place to the next, pushed around like cattle, with no regard for what had come before or what might come next. The Mongols did not speak to us, did not explain their actions. They merely acted, and we followed, our bodies moving in response to their commands, as though we were little more than tools to be used for their gain. The women and children were gathered in a separate group, kept apart from the men, though I never quite understood why. There were no explanations, no reason given for anything. The soldiers just divided us as they saw fit, as though we had no more value than the sacks of grain they might have plundered from a nearby village. The only thing that kept us together was our shared fate, our collective loss of everything that had once mattered. And even that seemed like an illusion, for there was no sense of community here, only survival. As the days turned into nights, I began to understand just how far the Mongols were willing to go in their quest for domination. They did not just destroy armies. They destroyed everything that made a person whole. Our names meant nothing. Our families meant nothing. We were nothing but a mass of bodies to be sorted, moved, and used at their will. And in that moment, I realized with a deep, painful clarity that the Mongols were not just conquerors. They were erasers of identity, destroyers of the very essence of what it meant to be human. I tried, in those days, to hold on to some part of myself, to remember who I had been before the soldiers arrived, before my world had been torn apart. But it was hard. There was no space for that here. There was no room for the things that once defined me. I was just another body, another face in the crowd, another prisoner among many. And in that crowd, I was lost. We all were. Each of us was a mere shadow of what we had been, reduced to something less than human by the cruel sorting of our captors. It was in this realization, this moment of cold clarity, that I understood the true horror of the Mongol invasion. It wasn't just the violence, the bloodshed, or the destruction. It was the quiet, insidious way in which they took everything from us, not with swords and arrows, but with the simple, brutal act of rendering us invisible. No longer individuals. No longer human. And so, we remained, herded together like cattle, waiting for whatever fate awaited us next, knowing in our hearts that the Mongols had already taken more from us than we could ever regain. The silence that followed the destruction of the village was suffocating, a silence so deep and profound that it felt as though even the earth itself was holding its breath. I remember the ashes swirling in the wind, a thick, gray cloud that coated everything, my skin, my hair, my clothes. It settled like dust on the remains of our once peaceful home, mingling with the faint smell of burnt wood and the remnants of the fires that had consumed everything we had known. The village, the heart of our lives, was now reduced to nothing more than a scattering of charred fragments. The homes we had once built now just hollowed shells, still smoking, still mourning. There was no sound, no birds calling, no children laughing, no voices from the market square or the riverbank. It was as though the world had fallen into a deep, eerie slumber, and there was no waking from it. In that silence, I could almost hear the hollow echo of our existence, fading into the distance as the wind carried away what remained of us. The captives, including myself, were left standing in the remains of our former lives, too stunned to speak, too broken to move. We were surrounded by the bodies of those who had not survived, their lifeless forms sprawled on the ground like discarded sacks of grain. There was no dignity in their deaths, no final resting place for them to be mourned. They were simply left there, just as we had been, abandoned in a field of ashes, our identities already stripped from us. The Mongol soldiers moved among us with a chilling efficiency. There was no time for sorrow, no time for reflection. Their faces were stoic, their movements calculated, as if they were sorting through cattle, not people. I could see them tugging at bodies, flipping them over as though determining which were fit for whatever purpose they had in mind. The dead were discarded with the same indifference as a broken tool, pushed aside as the living were separated out. It was then that the first wave of realization struck me with a terrible clarity. We were not viewed as human beings anymore. We were livestock, to be categorized and evaluated for our worth. The soldiers showed no interest in our grief, our pain, or our fear. They moved through the bodies with cold precision, their eyes scanning for any sign of life, pulling us apart, breaking our unity, deciding which of us might serve their needs. It wasn't long before they began to pull the living from the pile of bodies, inspecting us with a level of detachment that chilled me to the bone. I watched as men, women, and children were chosen, their fates sealed by the soldiers' hands. Some were lifted roughly, others barely able to stand, but none were spared the brutal gaze of the Mongol soldiers as they sorted us. Each of us was sized up, weighed in the cruelest sense of the word, not by our hearts or minds, but by our physical strength, our ability to serve, to endure. The sorting process was methodical, like a cattle auction, each individual treated as little more than a commodity. I could hear the soldiers speaking among themselves in their foreign language, discussing who would be useful for what task, who was strong enough to be of service, who could be used as labor, who could be discarded. The men were separated from the women and children, and I remember feeling the sharp sting of being classified, of being reduced to nothing more than my physical body, my capacity for survival, my ability to serve. I was tugged along with the others, my wrists still bound tightly, my feet dragging across the dirt. I could feel my heart beating heavily in my chest, the dread pooling in my stomach. I had no voice. I had no choice. The soldiers looked at us as though they were weighing cattle, deciding whether we were worthy of the effort it would take to keep us alive. I caught the eyes of a few women, others who had been swept up in this same fate, but we shared no words. What could we say? There was nothing left to say. Our identities, our lives, were now determined by how we could serve, how much value we had in this strange and cruel new world. The idea that we were no longer human, that we had become mere objects in the eyes of our captors, was a sharp, painful realization. I wanted to scream, to cry out that we were more than this, that we were more than bodies to be used and discarded. But in that moment, I understood with painful clarity that our worth no longer mattered in the way it once had. We were useful or useless. Nothing more. Nothing less. The soldiers continued their work, their hands pulling us apart, categorizing us as if we were nothing but the land or the animals they had conquered. The women, including myself, were herded together, but there was no comfort in that grouping. We were not allowed to speak, to comfort one another. We were silent, bound, broken by the weight of the reality that our lives had been stripped of meaning. Then came the final, devastating moment. The soldiers began taking us, one by one, into smaller groups, deciding who would be sent to work and who would be discarded to face a different fate. It was a harsh, heartless selection. The weak, the elderly, the injured, those who could not serve, were pushed aside, their fate sealed by a single, casual glance from a Mongol soldier. They were nothing to them. We were nothing to them. I watched as families were torn apart, the bonds of blood and love destroyed in an instant, not by the force of a sword, but by the casual indifference of those who held power over us. The men were led away, their strength no longer enough to protect them, and the women, the mothers, the daughters, were gathered in another group, each of us with no name, no identity beyond what we could do. The stripping of who we were had begun, not with violence, but with a quiet erasure of everything that had once made us whole. We were cattle. We were livestock. We were tools. That was all. I remember standing there, still bound, feeling the weight of the soldiers' gaze upon me. They saw nothing but my body. They didn't care who I had been, what I had known, who I had loved. They cared only about what I could give them, what I could provide. And in that moment, I understood that there was no longer any protection for us. We were at the mercy of those who held us captive, and they showed us none. The silence was unbearable, broken only by the harsh, quick commands of the soldiers as they continued their work. And in that silence, in that grim sorting of the living from the dead, I understood something that shook me to my core. Our very humanity had been stolen from us, one piece at a time, until we were nothing but husks, waiting to be filled with whatever purpose the Mongols saw fit. And so, the days stretched on, each one blending into the next, as we remained in that eerie, breathless stillness, waiting for whatever fate awaited us. Our lives, once full of meaning, were now reduced to a simple categorization, stripped of the things that had made us who we were. We were bodies, nothing more. The sun hung heavy in the sky, an oppressive weight that seemed to magnify the hopelessness of the scene unfolding before me. The bodies of those who had not survived the attack, those who had been slaughtered without mercy, lay scattered across the ground, forgotten in the chaos. There was no ceremony, no reverence for their lives. They were simply discarded, their once warm bodies now cold and lifeless, lying in heaps like refuse. The Mongol soldiers moved among the corpses with the same detached indifference they had shown when sorting the living. With little more than a grunt, they began piling the bodies together, their hands rough and uncaring as they heaved the lifeless forms into a massive heap. The bodies of men, women, and children, mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, were all tossed together with the same disregard, their once recognizable faces now hidden beneath the blanket of ash and blood that covered the earth. There was no time for mourning. There was no time for anything but survival. The soldiers moved with grim efficiency, as if the dead were no more than objects to be disposed of after their usefulness had been exhausted. Once the bodies were gathered into a pile, the flames were set. The fire leaped and cracked, consuming the remains, reducing them to nothing but blackened bones and ash. The smoke billowed into the sky, a thick, acrid cloud that seemed to choke the very air around us. The scent of burning flesh lingered in the air, mingling with the dust and the blood. It was a smell I would never forget, one that would stay with me long after this nightmare was over. As the fire blazed and the last remnants of life were burned away, the soldiers turned their attention to the living, to us, the ones who had somehow survived this brutal destruction. We were no longer individuals. We were no longer human in the sense we had once known. We were now objects, commodities, to be sorted, assessed, and discarded based on our perceived worth. The men were taken away first, herded like cattle to a separate part of the camp. Their strength, their usefulness, was immediately recognized. The soldiers took them without hesitation, marching them away with grim purpose, ready to put them to work as laborers, soldiers, or whatever else might serve the Mongol cause. But the women and children, the ones who remained, were treated differently. We were not considered for our strength alone. We were categorized by a different set of rules. The soldiers looked us over, sizing us up as though we were livestock, as though our only value lay in our ability to serve, to survive, to contribute. It was a slow, methodical process. The women were herded together into smaller groups, each one separated by perceived strength, by age, and by ability. The children were huddled together, some clinging to their mothers, others too dazed to understand what was happening. We were all pushed into lines, each of us facing the same terrifying uncertainty. The soldiers had no interest in our names, our stories, or our lives. They only cared about what we could offer, how we could serve. Those who were strong enough, those who could be useful, were chosen for tasks, labor, cooking, cleaning, anything that would keep the Mongol war machine moving. The rest of us, those who were seen as weak, were pushed aside, our fates already sealed. It was then that I felt the sharp sting of what we had lost, the stripping away of everything that had once made us who we were. The soldiers did not just take our land and our homes. They took everything else. They took our possessions, our clothes, our shoes, the small tokens of our former lives. My hair tie, once so carefully chosen, was torn from my hair and tossed aside like nothing. The shoes I had worn on countless journeys, the ones that had carried me through years of hard work, were ripped from my feet and thrown into a pile with the rest. The soldiers had no regard for these things. To them, we were nothing but bodies to be used, no different from the animals they herded or the tools they carried. The simple act of removing our possessions was not just about taking material things, it was about erasing our identity. The clothes we wore, the small ornaments we carried, the shoes we walked in. These were things that defined us, that marked us as individuals. But now, stripped of these things, we were nothing more than blank slates, waiting to be shaped by the whims of our captors. As I stood there, watching the soldiers strip us of everything, I began to understand the true nature of our situation. Our survival had nothing to do with mercy. It had nothing to do with kindness or compassion. It had everything to do with our perceived usefulness. We were not here because the Mongols had any care for our well-being. We were here because we could serve them. And those of us who could not serve, who could not work, who could not contribute in some way, those of us who were too weak, too broken, were of no value. And in the eyes of the Mongols, we were disposable. It was a harsh truth, one that settled deep into my bones. In that moment, I realized that I was no longer an individual. I was no longer a daughter, a sister, a friend. I was a piece of the war economy. I was a part of the machinery that drove the Mongol Empire forward. My life, my worth, had been reduced to a simple calculation of strength and utility. And in this new world, my survival depended entirely on how much I could contribute to the Empire's needs. The realization hit me like a wave, crashing over me and pulling me under. I had once been a person. I had once been someone with a name, with a past, with hopes and dreams. But all of that was gone now. I was nothing but a tool, a cog in the wheel of the Mongol machine. And I had no say in the matter. I had no control over my fate. The soldiers moved through the groups, continuing their work of sorting, categorizing, and stripping us of everything that had once made us whole. There was no mercy here, no kindness. There was only the cold, calculated logic of survival. And in that moment, I realized that survival, for us, meant something different than it had ever meant before. It was no longer about living for ourselves, for our families, for our futures. It was about surviving for the Empire, for the Mongols, for whatever value we could provide. We were no longer individuals. We were parts of a machine. And the only thing that mattered now was whether we could keep turning, whether we could keep moving, whether we could keep working. It was a brutal, dehumanizing truth, but it was the truth nonetheless. As I stood there, stripped of my possessions, my identity, and my past, I felt a deep sense of loss, not just for what I had once had, but for what we had all lost. Our humanity, our sense of self. In the eyes of the Mongols, we were no longer people. We were just bodies, just tools, just pieces in a game much larger than ourselves. And so, we continued, moving through the days as we had moved through the endless sorting process. Like cattle, like livestock, with no more claim to our own lives than the animals in the fields. The question of who we had been, who we had loved, and what we had dreamed no longer mattered. We were here now, in the hands of the Mongols, and all that mattered was whether we could survive long enough to see another day. The march seemed endless. It stretched on day after day, an unforgiving journey that blurred the line between time and space. We were herded forward like cattle, driven by the crack of the Mongol soldiers' whips and the harsh commands barked at us. The path was never smooth, always uneven, always treacherous, and we moved forward with only one thing on our minds: survival. There was no food. There was no water. The soldiers had long since abandoned any pretense of caring for us, and our bodies had become nothing more than a means to an end. They didn't feed us, didn't offer us even the most basic relief from the oppressive heat that bore down on us. The land we crossed was dry and unforgiving, the sun a constant, searing presence in the sky, its rays cutting into our skin like a blade. Our throats were parched, our stomachs empty, and yet we were forced to keep moving, our feet dragging over the hard earth. The sweat clung to our bodies, mixing with the dirt and dust that coated our skin. It was a feeling I will never forget, the constant, sticky wetness that never left us, a suffocating reminder of the toll this march was taking on us. But it wasn't just the heat that broke us. It was the pain. My feet, raw and bleeding from days of walking barefoot, had long ago lost all feeling. Every step felt like a punishment, the ground rough and jagged beneath me, tearing at my skin. I had no choice but to keep moving. What else was there to do? There was no hope, no refuge. There was only the endless march, and the soldiers who made sure we stayed in line. The hunger gnawed at me, a constant, vicious pain in my gut. It felt like a part of me had died, replaced by this hollow emptiness that could never be filled. I could hear the grumbling stomachs of the others around me, the sound of suffering that filled the air like a low, constant hum. We were all starving, all desperate, but the soldiers paid no mind. They were indifferent to our suffering. They had no interest in our cries for food or water. We were nothing to them, just bodies, moving forward, existing only to serve their needs. I tried not to think about the pain, about the hunger. I tried not to focus on the sight of the others, their faces gaunt and their eyes hollow, their bodies shrinking with every passing hour. But it was hard to ignore. It was impossible to ignore the toll the march was taking on us. Each day felt like an eternity, and with each step, I could feel my strength slipping away, my will to continue draining from me like the water I so desperately needed. But the worst part wasn't the physical toll, the pain in my feet, the burning heat, the gnawing hunger. It was the slow, creeping realization that some of us would not make it. As the days dragged on, I saw the first signs of weakness among the group. The old, the sick, the fragile. They began to falter, their steps slower, their bodies breaking down under the strain. Some of them tried to push forward, tried to keep up, but it was clear they were not going to last. And the soldiers, those cold, indifferent Mongols, paid them no mind. If you fell behind, if you couldn't keep up, you were left behind. No mercy, no second chances. The soldiers would barely glance back as they watched us struggle. If someone fell, they were ignored, their fate sealed by the cruel indifference of their captors. It didn't matter if it was a mother with a child in her arms, or an elderly man who had been too weak from the start. If you couldn't move fast enough, if you couldn't keep up with the pace, you were discarded like an old tool, no longer of any use. It was the way of the Mongols, survival of the fittest, with no room for weakness. And so, one by one, the weaker captives began to fall. I watched as they stumbled, their bodies giving out from the strain, and I could feel the weight of their suffering in my chest. I saw one woman collapse to the ground, her legs buckling beneath her. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. She tried to rise, to get back on her feet, but the soldiers didn't care. They didn't even slow their pace. They just kept walking, leaving her behind like a discarded rag. I could hear her faint cries for help, but they were drowned out by the sound of the marching soldiers and the crunch of boots on the earth. The few of us who remained, those who still had enough strength to keep moving, did what we could to comfort one another, but there was little we could offer. We were all in the same state, all struggling to keep our bodies moving, to hold on to the sliver of life that remained. But even in our suffering, we knew the truth. There would be no mercy. There would be no salvation for the weak. Every now and then, I heard a cry or a shout from behind, and I knew what it meant. Another had fallen. Another had been left behind. The Mongols did not stop. They did not care. If you couldn't keep up, you were nothing. You were discarded. The long march was a brutal test, a trial of strength and endurance, and those who could not endure were swept away like dust in the wind. There was a moment, during one of those long stretches of walking, when I began to feel my own body giving way. My steps were slower, more labored. My vision blurred from the hunger, from the lack of water. My feet were raw and bleeding, and the pain was unbearable. But still, I kept going, kept moving forward, because what else was there to do? What choice did we have but to survive? The soldiers would punish any delay, any moment of weakness. The faintest hesitation would be met with a sharp command, a blow from a whip, or a kick to send us back into motion. They didn't care about our pain. They didn't care about our exhaustion. The only thing that mattered was the march, the endless, relentless march. As the days stretched into weeks, I came to understand the true cruelty of the Mongol Empire. It wasn't just the brutality of their weapons, or the fire they rained down upon our villages. It was their indifference to suffering. It was the way they treated us, not as people, not as individuals, but as tools, as nothing more than instruments in their war machine. If we were no longer useful, if we could no longer keep up, we were discarded, and it was as simple as that. The long march became a constant reminder of how fragile we were, how easily we could be broken. Our bodies, our spirits, were tested to the limit, and those who could not endure were left behind, their names forgotten, their lives erased by the unforgiving march of the Mongol Empire. It was survival of the fittest, and only those who could endure the pain, the hunger, the exhaustion, would live to see another day. And so we kept walking, kept moving forward, one painful step after another, with no idea where we were going, no idea what awaited us. The road ahead seemed endless, the sun always setting too soon, the nights too long. But there was no turning back, no hope for rest, no time for mercy. There was only the march, and the brutal, heartless conditions that would determine who would survive, and who would be left behind. The journey felt endless, a long procession of hills and barren landscapes stretching out before us, each one more unforgiving than the last. There was no sign of life, no trace of civilization, just the dry earth beneath our feet and the endless horizon that seemed to go on forever. I had no idea where we were going, no idea where the Mongols were leading us. There was no word of comfort, no explanation of what lay ahead. All that mattered was movement, the constant, relentless forward motion. We were swept along like grains of sand in the wind, carried forward by the force of those who controlled our fate. The land was harsh and unforgiving, a wasteland that offered no solace, no respite from the pain. The hills we climbed were steep and jagged, and the dust from the earth followed us, coating our skin, clogging our throats. It was as if the very air we breathed conspired against us, turning every step into an exhausting battle. The hills seemed to rise without end, each one leading us into another dry, barren stretch of land, and each one stripping us of whatever strength we had left. There were no trees for shade, no rivers for refreshment. The sun bore down on us with a cruelty I had never known before, its heat searing my skin, its rays so harsh and unforgiving that it felt as if the earth itself was burning. My lips cracked and bled from the dryness, and my tongue felt thick and swollen, its thirst unquenched by the empty air. We had no water. None. I could feel the dryness crawling inside my mouth, seeping deep into my body, slowly draining what little life was left. As the days passed, my body began to betray me. The heat from the sun and the lack of water took their toll. My skin cracked under the intense heat, and I felt every step in my bones. My body was becoming a desert, dry and brittle, aching with every movement. The heat seemed to seep into my very bones, the sweat on my skin turning to salt, stinging my eyes and burning my raw lips. Every time I moved, it felt like my skin was pulling itself tight, stretched to its limits. The sun, relentless and unforgiving, showed no mercy. It had no interest in whether we survived. It was simply another force, another part of the landscape that showed no care for our suffering. And yet, despite the pain, despite the exhaustion, the march never slowed. The Mongols were indifferent to our needs, to our suffering. There was no room for weakness here. There was no time for delays, no space for rest. If we faltered, if we couldn't keep up, we were simply left behind. The soldiers moved forward without a glance, without a care. They had no interest in our pain or our needs. We were nothing more than a tool to be used, and if we couldn't endure, if we couldn't keep up with their pace, we were discarded. I saw it happen to others. They stumbled, their bodies giving way under the strain. Some were older, some were sick, some were just too weak to continue. But the Mongols didn't care. They didn't stop to help, to offer a hand. If you couldn't walk, you were left behind. I watched as one man collapsed, his knees buckling beneath him, his face drawn and pale from exhaustion. His body shook with the effort to rise, to stand, but he couldn't. He was too weak. The Mongol soldiers barely noticed, barely even looked his way. They simply kept moving, as if his life, his struggle, meant nothing. It wasn't long before he was left behind, his body lying in the dust, forgotten. It was the same with so many others. Those who couldn't keep up were discarded. Their fates sealed the moment they faltered. There was no mercy, no compassion. It was as if the Mongols saw us as little more than parts in a machine. If one part broke, it was simply replaced. If one of us could not go on, they were simply left to die. We had no say in it. There was no choice but to keep moving, to ignore the pain, to ignore the weakness that was creeping into our limbs. The soldiers would not wait. If we fell behind, we paid the price. The punishment was swift, and the penalty was brutal. Being left behind to die in the dust, to be swallowed up by the harsh, unforgiving landscape. We had no rights. We had no say. We were nothing more than tools, and the only way to survive was to keep moving. The harshness of the journey became clearer with each passing day. The land, the sun, the exhaustion, they all conspired against us. And the Mongols, with their cold, indifferent gaze, made it clear that we were expendable. Every delay, every falter, was punished. Every moment of weakness was met with the harsh lash of a whip, the cruel jab of a spear, or the force of a boot pushing us forward. The pace never slowed, and our bodies, our minds, were pushed to the limit. I began to feel like a part of the landscape myself, like I was becoming one with the earth beneath me, just another small, insignificant piece of the world that had no real value. The hills kept rising, the sun kept burning, and the pain, the constant hunger, the thirst, and the crushing weight of our vulnerability continued to grow. But still, we moved forward. There was no stopping us. There was no end to this journey, no relief in sight. And yet, even in the midst of this brutal march, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of camaraderie with those around me. We were all in this together, all bound by the same fate, all struggling to survive in a world that had turned against us. It was a fragile bond, one built on shared suffering and shared survival. But it was enough to keep us moving, even when every part of me wanted to collapse, to give in to the unbearable weight of it all. But no matter how hard we tried, no matter how much we pushed ourselves to keep going, the reality was inescapable. We were at the mercy of the Mongols, and they showed us none. Their indifference to our suffering, their disregard for our weakness, was a constant reminder that we were nothing more than bodies, moving forward, one step at a time, until we reached the end of this long, painful journey. And so, we continued, step by painful step, across the barren hills and the endless, unyielding earth. The journey, the march, would not end until it had taken everything from us. Our strength, our dignity, our humanity. And even then, it would not stop. The Mongols would push us on, and we would keep moving, because there was no other choice. There was no other way to survive. As the day's scorching heat finally began to wane, the harsh bite of the cold on the steppe took its place. The shift from searing heat to numbing cold came swiftly, as though the land itself had been torn between two forces. It was a cold that crept into your bones, cold so deep and relentless that it felt like it might swallow you whole. The ground beneath us, still harsh and unforgiving from the day's blistering sun, became a frozen bed of sharp, jagged stones, biting at our tired, aching bodies. We had no blankets, no shelter to protect us from the cold. We were forced to sleep on the bare earth, our bodies pressed close together for whatever warmth we could offer one another. The other captives, huddled together in the bitter chill, became a fragile community, one born of necessity rather than kindness. We had no words for each other, but our proximity, our shared suffering, became a language of its own. We reached out in the dark, our hands touching, finding any small warmth we could offer. In the midst of the freezing night, I would curl as tightly as I could, my arms wrapped around myself, my legs drawn up under me to conserve what little warmth I had. But still, the cold pierced through, leaving me trembling, shaking with a deep, unrelenting chill that seemed to come from within. The women beside me would try to draw closer, sharing body heat in a desperate attempt to stave off the cold. Sometimes, if I was lucky, I would feel the warmth of another body near mine. But even that warmth seemed to slip away as quickly as it came, the cold always pressing in, relentless. It was in these moments, in the freezing, dark hours of the night, that I felt most like an animal. The need for warmth, the need to survive, became all-consuming. There was no room for anything else. My body was a shell, a vessel simply trying to endure. I could no longer think of who I had been before this, who I had once been. The cold swallowed those thoughts, numbed them into silence. All that mattered was surviving, keeping my body alive through the night and pushing forward in the morning. But the Mongol soldiers, though present around us, were indifferent to our suffering. They did not care whether we froze, whether we lived or died. The captives' suffering was not personal to them. It was simply part of the process, a byproduct of their conquest. They moved among us with the same detached cruelty they had shown from the start, offering no respite, no kindness. The cold was just another tool in their arsenal, just another way to wear us down, to break our spirits and make us pliable. If we died from exposure, from the cold, from exhaustion, it was of no consequence to them. Their indifference was a harsh reminder that we were nothing more than numbers in their campaign, easily replaced by others. The soldiers spoke in gruff tones, their words foreign and clipped, their actions quick and harsh. They seemed unaffected by the biting cold, their thick furs offering them protection while we were left to suffer. They had no interest in our discomfort. There was no mercy, no care for the weak or the weary. To them, we were not people, not women or children with histories or hopes. We were simply tools, and if those tools broke, there were always more to take. It was in this grim reality that I found myself retreating into my mind. I could no longer afford to think about the past, about who I was, what I had lost, what I had once hoped for. To do so would have been to crumble beneath the weight of my memories, to be crushed under the emotional toll of everything that had been taken from me. Instead, I focused only on the smallest, simplest tasks, moving my feet, taking each step in turn. With each step forward, I could shut out the cold for just a moment, shut out the gnawing hunger, the hopelessness. I could simply move, and that movement, that constant forward motion, became my lifeline. Each night, as I lay shivering, trying to hold on to some semblance of warmth, I reminded myself to breathe, to focus on the rhythm of my body. My mind wandered, yes, but I fought it. I refused to let it settle on the things I had lost, the home, the family, the peace. I could not afford to think about any of it. If I allowed myself to feel too much, I knew I would break. The only way to survive was to numb myself, to push all thoughts of the past away. The past was gone. The future was uncertain. All I had was the present, and in that present, I only had one goal: to keep moving, to keep my feet moving, to stay alive. In the mornings, When the first light of day crept over the horizon, we would rise, stiff and cold, our bodies sore from the hard earth and the long hours of discomfort. There was no time for warmth, no time for comfort. We were driven forward again, herded along like cattle, no different from the day before, no different from the day before that. But the nights, they were the hardest, the coldest, the longest. And in those nights, I learned the art of survival, not through strength or power, but through the ability to shut out the world, to shut out everything but the next step, the next breath. The Mongols, with their cruel indifference, had made us forget ourselves. They had stripped us of our names, our histories, and our dreams. And now, in the biting cold of the steppe, in the cruel silence of the night, they had taken even our warmth from us. All that remained was the raw, empty need to survive. And so, I focused on that need. I focused on keeping my body alive, on moving forward, step by painful step. There was no room for anything else. No room for grief. No room for fear. No room for hope. There was only the cold, the endless march, and the burning need to stay alive, to make it through one more night, one more day. And in that, I found the only peace I could. The peace of survival. Life in the camp was an endless reminder that we had ceased to be anything but commodities. The air was thick with the scent of sweat, dust, and the faint acrid tang of smoke from the fires. The captives, now just bodies in a sprawling, filthy encampment, moved in a slow, monotonous shuffle, driven by the same instinct to survive that had kept us alive through the march. The harsh reality that we were no longer people, no longer individuals with names and stories, became clearer with each passing day. We were nothing more than goods to be assessed, evaluated, and used as the Mongols saw fit. The Mongol soldiers moved through the camp with cold, indifferent eyes, their expressions hard and unyielding. They didn't look at us as human beings. They didn't care about our pasts or our pain. We were simply tools, resources, items that could be used or discarded according to their whims. There was no kindness, no empathy, just the chilling efficiency of a well-oiled machine of war. They would glance at us, sizing us up, looking for strength, looking for obedience. If we showed even the faintest sign of weakness, we were ignored or punished, treated as if we were worthless. I learned quickly that to show anything but compliance was to invite trouble. The soldiers had no use for defiance, no tolerance for disobedience. And so, I kept my head down, kept my gaze fixed on the ground, never meeting their eyes, never drawing attention to myself. I had learned the rules of submission, the silent language of survival. It was simple: show no weakness, make no noise, and do not attract attention. To do otherwise was to risk punishment or worse, to risk being sold off, traded, discarded as if you were nothing more than a broken tool. Food in the camp was a luxury, one that we rarely saw in any meaningful quantity. The soldiers ate first, their rations always fresh, always plentiful. They would sit together, their faces hard and proud, their bellies full, while we watched from the edges, hungry and desperate. We were given the scraps: dried meat, stale bread, small pieces of hard, tasteless grain. We had to fight for it, scramble for what little we could get, our hands trembling with hunger as we reached for the meager portions. But even the scraps were sometimes withheld, sometimes only offered in exchange for obedience, for compliance. There was no fairness here. There was no justice. We were not people in this camp. We were less than that. We were tools, tools to be used when necessary, discarded when we had no more value. The Mongols were indifferent to our suffering. They saw us as part of the process, part of the engine of their empire, nothing more. And if one of us faltered, if one of us became too weak, too sick, too slow, there was no sympathy, no time to care. We were simply left behind, abandoned to the cruel elements or worse. One of the most chilling aspects of life in the camp was how easily we were bartered, traded like livestock, passed from one soldier to another as if we were mere objects. It was an unsettling process, watching the Mongols assess us, their eyes scanning us as though we were nothing more than animals on display, available for purchase. They would look us over, appraise our bodies, judge our strength, our endurance, our potential for labor. A glance here, A few words exchanged there, and just like that, we were sold. Our ownership shifted from one man to another, as easily as a horse being traded for grain. I was one of the many who was traded in this way. The first time it happened, I could hardly believe it. I was dragged from the small group of captives where I had been placed, shoved forward like an animal being led to market. The Mongol soldiers examined me with impassive eyes, their fingers grazing over my arms, my legs, as if measuring my strength, my potential. One of them spoke to another in their harsh tongue, and I could see in their eyes that I had been deemed valuable. My body, strong, unmarked by illness, capable of enduring pain, was of use to them. I was sold to the highest bidder. I felt a strange, cold numbness take over as I was passed from one soldier to another. My mind, in that moment, wanted to protest, wanted to scream that I was more than this, that I was a human being, that I had a life outside of this nightmare. But no sound came. I had learned long ago that to fight, to resist, was to invite cruelty. I had learned that my worth here was determined by what I could do, by what I could endure. And so, I submitted, moving forward as though I were nothing more than a piece of meat on a butcher's block, my fate decided by the casual gaze of another Mongol. The cruelty of it was almost more than I could bear. I was not a person anymore. I was a thing, an object, my future determined by my physical attributes, my strength, my obedience, my usefulness. I was valued for what I could provide, for how much labor I could give, for how much I could endure. And in that moment, I realized something that sank deep into my bones. I had lost everything. I had lost my name, my family, my identity. I was no longer an individual. I was a tool to be used, a body to be exploited. There was no room for dreams, no room for hope, in the Mongol camp. The only thing that mattered was survival, and survival depended on our value to the empire. It was a harsh, brutal truth. But it was the truth, and it was a truth I had to accept if I wanted to stay alive. Each day in the camp was a reminder of my place in this new world, a world where I was not a person, but a thing, an object to be used and discarded at will. I had no control over my fate. I had no say in what happened to me. I was owned, traded, and bartered, a pawn in a much larger game. But there was still one thing I could control. I could survive. And that became my focus, my single goal. Because in this world, survival was all that mattered. And so, I moved forward, step by step, my identity slipping further and further away, my worth now determined by my ability to endure, to obey, to serve. I had learned the rules of this new world, and in that, I found the only peace I could. The peace of knowing that, for now, at least, I was still alive. The Mongol women in the camp moved through the chaos with a quiet authority, their presence felt but rarely acknowledged. They were not like the soldiers, who spoke loudly and acted with overt power. Instead, the women seemed to have a more subtle form of command. They watched, observed, and from the shadows of the encampment, they made decisions that would shape our fates. I remember seeing them for the first time, standing near the edges of the group, their faces mostly hidden beneath the hoods of their fur-lined cloaks, but their eyes, those eyes were sharp. They looked at us like we were a puzzle to be solved, their gaze flicking over our bodies, assessing us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Their role was not to lead the soldiers, but to make choices about what would happen to us once we were taken, once we were captured and dehumanized by the Mongol army. These women were the ones who decided which of us would be of use, which ones could be bartered for labor or traded for goods, and which ones would be kept for the soldiers' personal use. They looked at us not as people, but as possessions, tools that could be utilized or discarded at will. The first time I saw one of them approach a group of captives, I was struck by the quiet power in her movements. She walked among us with the confidence of someone who knew their worth. She did not need to shout or command. She simply watched, and when she spoke, it was as if the soldiers obeyed without question. The Mongol women were an integral part of the machine, wielding their authority not through physical force but through their understanding of the empire's needs, its ruthless necessity. They were, in a way, the final decision-makers when it came to the captive's fate. They saw us for what we were, tools to be used or discarded, depending on the needs of the empire. There was no emotion in their judgment, no sympathy. There was only cold, efficient calculation. I had seen this before, of course, the soldiers' indifference to our suffering. But there was something different about the Mongol women. They didn't just look at us with cold eyes. There was something more, something calculating in their gaze. They evaluated us as if they were deciding which crop to harvest, which animals were strong enough to pull the plow. I felt like I was nothing more than an item to be appraised, measured for my strength, for my value in a world where survival depended on what I could give. As the days passed and I found myself moved from one soldier to the next, traded like livestock, the resignation inside me deepened. My fate had shifted so many times now, taken from one soldier, passed to another, my body sold like an object without a soul, that I had come to understand a hard truth. I had no control over what happened to me. I was not an individual anymore. I was a possession, moved by the whims of the Mongols, my life shaped entirely by their needs. Each time I was handed over to another soldier, I could feel the weight of that truth sink deeper into my bones. The soldiers didn't care who I had been or what I had lost. I was only worth the labor I could provide, the strength I could give. I had learned, the hard way, that there was no room for resistance here. There was no place for defiance. I had to accept my new role, my new life. It was the only way to survive. But with every shift in ownership, a part of me died. It wasn't just the loss of my possessions, my identity, my future. It was the quiet erasure of who I was, who I had been. I was no longer a person with hopes, with a family, with dreams. I was a thing, a body, a resource, something to be moved from one place to the next, to be used until I could no longer serve. And yet, despite the crushing weight of that knowledge, I had learned to submit. I had learned that survival was no longer about holding on to the past. It was about enduring. It was about accepting my fate without resistance. There was no choice, not really. What was there to fight against? What hope was left when all you had was the cold, indifferent reality of survival? Each day, as I saw other captives fall behind, as I watched the men and women who could not endure being left in the dust, I reminded myself that I had made it this far, that I had survived. I kept my head down, avoided the eyes of the soldiers, and did what I had to do to stay alive. But inside, I knew the truth. The more I gave in, the more I let go of the person I had once been, the more I became a part of this unfeeling, brutal machine. The Mongol women watched us, assessed us, made the decisions that shaped our fates. But in the end, it didn't matter who was in charge. We were all just pieces, interchangeable, to be used until we were no longer needed. And so, as my ownership shifted once again, I braced myself for whatever was to come. I had no say in it. I had no control over my fate. All I could do was move forward, step by step, with no thought of the past, no hope for the future. I had learned to surrender to the process, to the cold inevitability of this new life. The Mongols didn't care. The Mongol women didn't care. And soon, neither did I. Survival, it seemed, was all that mattered now. The day I was moved to the cleaning area was marked by a grim sense of finality. It was a process I had seen others undergo, and I knew, deep down, that it was now my turn. The soldiers had begun to pull us aside, one by one, and though I didn't understand fully what was about to happen, I could feel the shift in the air. There was no room for doubt now. I was no longer the person I had been when I first arrived in this camp. Whatever had come before, whatever life I had once known, was now a distant memory, slipping further away with every passing moment. The Mongols had already stripped me of my name, my dignity, and now they were taking away my very identity. The cleaning was not a gentle process. It was brutal in its efficiency, a methodical, almost mechanical act designed to erase every trace of who we had been before, to make us something new, something useful to the Mongol war machine. I was washed, scrubbed with harsh hands and rough cloths that felt more like sandpaper against my skin than anything resembling care. The water was cold, almost painfully so, and the sting of it only added to the sense of humiliation that crept through me. I had once known what it felt like to be clean, to feel the warm comfort of fresh water on my skin. But that was a lifetime ago. Now, the water felt like a tool of erasure, washing away the last remnants of who I had been. As the soldiers worked their way across my body, I felt each pass of the cloth pull away pieces of my former self. I wasn't allowed to speak, wasn't allowed to resist. My hands, still bound by the ropes they had put on me days ago, were tugged roughly to the sides. I had no control over my body in these moments, no say in how I was treated. The soldiers worked with an indifference that almost seemed designed to break us. The act of cleaning wasn't just physical. It was psychological, an attempt to rebrand us as something else, as something new and nameless. We were no longer people, not in the way we had once been. We were tools, to be shaped and reshaped as the Mongols saw fit. Once the cleaning was finished, I was led away from the others, moved to a separate area of the camp that had been set aside for captives like me. It was a quieter, more organized part of the camp, tucked away from the chaos of the larger encampment. It felt different, sterile, almost. The soldiers who watched over this part of the camp were colder, more efficient in their movements, as though their role was not just to guard us but to monitor our every move, to make sure we stayed in line. It was here that I was given new clothing. The tunic they handed me was rough, made of a coarse, uncomfortable material that scratched against my skin with every movement. It was a symbol of my new identity, my new role as a captive in the Mongol Empire. The fabric was dyed a dull brown, a color that matched the dullness I felt inside. The tunic fit poorly, too loose around my shoulders, too tight around my waist. I couldn't help but feel that it was meant to make me uncomfortable, to remind me that I was no longer who I had once been. The clothing was not just practical. It was symbolic. It was meant to strip away any remaining trace of my past, to erase the person I had once been and replace her with a new identity. I was no longer a daughter, a sister, a person with a past. I was now part of the machinery of the Mongol Empire, a tool to be used until I could no longer serve. The tunic was a constant reminder of that, rubbing against my skin, pressing against the raw, tender places that the harsh cleaning had left behind. It felt like a mark of ownership, a visible indicator that I was now nothing but a possession. As I moved deeper into the new area of the camp, I realized that this part of the camp was different from where the other captives had been kept. It was cleaner, more organized, with fewer people. The guards here were stricter, watching our every move with the kind of precision that suggested we were not meant to interact with anyone outside our new group. There was a sense of isolation in this space, as though we had been set apart from the rest of the captives, separated not just by physical distance but by the roles we now played in the Mongol system. We were, in a sense, marked. We were no longer part of the mass of captives that had been taken and sorted, no longer just numbers to be thrown together. We had been rebranded, reshaped into something new. I had been moved from the chaos of the larger camp, away from the others, to this quieter, more controlled space. And in this space, I felt the weight of my new reality more than ever. My ownership had shifted once again, and I knew that it would not be the last time. I had been stripped of my past, of my name, of any hope of returning to the life I once knew. Now, I was no longer just a captive in a larger group. I was an individual, set apart for a new purpose, one that had nothing to do with the person I had once been. The new clothes, the new space, the new isolation, it all served to reinforce the one truth I could no longer escape. I was no longer an individual. I was part of the system now, a cog in the machinery of the Mongol Empire. I had been rebranded, reshaped, and my purpose was no longer my own. It was something determined by the Mongols, and I had no choice but to accept it. As I stood there in the quiet of the new area, the weight of my new life settling over me, I could feel the finality of it. The past was gone. The future was uncertain. All that was left was the present. The harsh, sterile present where I was now nothing more than a tool to be used, a possession to be managed. And I understood, with painful clarity, that this was my new reality. My fate had already been decided. All that remained was for me to accept it, to play the role that had been assigned to me, and to survive, if only for one more day. In the new life I had been thrust into, silence became a survival tactic, a shield that kept me invisible to the eyes of the Mongol soldiers. The rules of the camp were clear, at least to those of us who had learned the way things worked. We were to make no sound, attract no attention, and never, under any circumstances, show any weakness. Silence was not just a courtesy. It was a necessity, a means of preserving whatever was left of us. It kept us out of sight, kept us from being noticed, kept us from being punished or discarded like so many others. The more we faded into the background, the less likely we were to become targets. The camp was a place of order, but it was an order imposed with cruelty, where efficiency was paramount and the personal lives of the captives held no value. Every action was part of a larger machine, a relentless process that chewed through people without ever stopping to ask if they were human. The camp itself was a mechanism, brutal, methodical, and devoid of any personal significance. The soldiers moved through the camp with purpose, their actions deliberate, as if everything had been carefully planned to ensure that the captives were always under control, always in line. There was no room for hesitation, no space for compassion. Everything in the camp worked in a precise rhythm, a rhythm that the captives had no say in, a rhythm that pushed us forward without a care for who we were. Each day felt like a repeat of the last, each moment defined by the same brutal efficiency. We were kept in our places, separated from one another, our lives reduced to the tasks we were given. Every move was watched, every word weighed for its potential to draw attention. The soldiers who walked through the camp didn't care about the people they had captured. They cared only about the tasks at hand. If a soldier looked at you, it wasn't with curiosity, but with the impersonal eye of someone assessing what use you might have. You were not a person to them, just another piece of the machinery that kept the camp running. As my days blurred into one another, I was assigned new duties. There was no choice, no possibility of escape. The work was grueling, and the tasks varied, but the expectation was the same. Do your job, remain unnoticed, and survive. I spent my days cleaning the soldiers' quarters, sweeping dirt floors, scrubbing pots and pans, wiping down surfaces, all without the faintest word of thanks or recognition. There was no conversation, no moment to connect with another person. I was an extension of the camp's machinery, a tool that could be used until it was no longer needed. My hands were always moving, always cleaning, always carrying, always serving. But it was as if I didn't exist beyond the tasks I was given. There was no room for personal connection in this world. The few words exchanged between the captives were whispers, hushed and careful, as though speaking too loudly could bring punishment. In the rare moments when we were allowed to sit together, there was no room for talking, for sharing memories or dreams. We were all too busy surviving, too busy clinging to the smallest scraps of existence. The fear of attracting attention was always there, an unspoken rule that hovered over every movement, every action. To speak too much, to be seen as anything other than compliant, could mean punishment or worse, being sold off, traded, discarded like a useless tool. And so, we stayed silent, watching each other only with our eyes, never with our hearts. We had no choice but to remain invisible, to fade into the background, hoping to avoid the spotlight that could bring swift and merciless punishment. Food was another harsh reality in this new life. We were fed just enough to remain functional, just enough to keep moving, to keep working, to keep our bodies alive. There was no thought to our comfort, no regard for our well-being. We ate what we were given, scraps, often stale and barely enough to fill the gnawing hunger in our stomachs. There was no luxury here, no indulgence, only survival. A small portion of hard bread, a piece of dried meat, a bit of gruel. The soldiers ate well, always first, their bellies full, while we waited in line for whatever was left. What we ate was enough to keep us from collapsing in the dirt, enough to keep our bodies functioning at a basic level. But it was never enough to feel strong, to feel healthy. We were not meant to thrive, not meant to enjoy the fruits of life. We were meant to endure, to suffer, to work until we could work no more. I came to understand that the purpose of this camp, this brutal existence, was not to care for us, not to protect us, but to use us until there was nothing left. The captives were like machines, programmed to carry out tasks, to serve, to obey. If we broke, if we fell behind, if we couldn't keep up, we were discarded. The focus was on efficiency, on keeping the system moving, not on any individual's needs or desires. We were part of the process, no more important than the tools the soldiers carried, the horses they rode, or the weapons they wielded. In the silence of my new life, I learned to survive by keeping my head down and my hands busy. I did not think of the life I had once had, the family I had lost, the person I had been before the Mongols had come. To do so would have been to invite despair. Instead, I focused on the small tasks before me, the cleaning, the carrying, the serving, and tried to find meaning in the simplicity of it. I held on to the small, mundane acts of survival, because they were all I had left. I knew that as long as I kept my head down, stayed invisible, and did my work, I could survive. There would be no rebellion here, no chance for escape. There would be no rescue, no salvation. There was only the quiet rhythm of the camp, the work, the hunger, and the endless silence. And in that silence, in that submission, I found the one thing that kept me going: survival. Not in the way I had once imagined, not in the way I had once hoped, but in the cold, harsh reality of this new existence. And that was enough, for now, to keep me alive. The cold of the camp never let up, a constant companion that gnawed at our bones, creeping into our muscles and minds. It wasn't just the frigid temperatures that made life unbearable. It was the way the cold seemed to seep into everything. The food we were given, the air we breathed, the silence that enveloped us each night. The wind howled through the barren landscape, sharp and relentless, and we were left exposed to it, with nothing but the thin, rough tunics we were given to protect us. Even the earth itself seemed to be frozen, hard and unyielding, a harsh reminder of our place in the world, the place of the conquered, the silenced, the expendable. This world I now inhabited was built on a harsh reality, one where hierarchy ruled above all. The Mongol soldiers, the masters of this camp, moved with a clear sense of superiority. They were at the top, the captors, the ones who decided our fate, who dictated the rules of our existence. We, the captives, were at the bottom, our worth determined by our physical labor, our ability to endure, our silence. There was no room for anything else, no room for rebellion, no room for individuality. The system was simple: obey, survive, or be discarded. In a way, the clarity of it made survival easier to comprehend. There was no gray area, no room for question or thought, only the brutal, unyielding reality of where we stood. As I watched the soldiers move through the camp, commanding with the arrogance of those who knew they had power over others, I learned to keep my head down, to avoid drawing attention. The hierarchy of the camp was as rigid as the soldiers themselves. Those who were stronger, who had the skills or the strength to be useful, were given better treatment, more food, more freedom to move, more opportunities to avoid punishment. But for those of us who had no value, who were too weak, too sick, or too tired, there was nothing. No mercy, no kindness. We were left to fend for ourselves, our bodies pushed to their limits as we carried out our duties, our minds focused only on the next step, the next task, the next moment of survival. It was during the long nights, as I lay on the cold earth, shivering from the biting wind and the exhaustion that seemed to cling to me like a second skin, that I heard the proud songs of the Mongol soldiers. Their voices rang out, deep and full of pride, carrying the stories of their conquests, their victories, their unstoppable march across the land. The songs spoke of power, of strength, of a world built on conquest and domination. To them, it was a celebration of all they had achieved, their empire, their legacy, their rule over those who had been conquered. I could hear the joy in their voices as they sang, their pride in their power. But for me, the songs only deepened the sense of alienation that had settled inside me since the moment I was taken. I could never feel a part of their world, could never understand the triumph they celebrated. They sang of victory, but all I could feel was the weight of my own defeat. I was nothing in their world, just a body to be used, a tool to be discarded when it no longer served a purpose. The music that once might have stirred something inside me, might have once been a part of my own world, now felt foreign, detached. I didn't belong there. I didn't belong in their world of conquest, of endless war and bloodshed. I was a prisoner, and their victories meant nothing to me. And perhaps, that was the greatest cruelty of all. Not the physical punishments, not the whips or the chains, but the overwhelming indifference of the Mongols. The soldiers didn't care about us. They didn't care about our lives, our hopes, or our stories. They didn't see us as people. We were nothing to them, just another conquered group, another set of bodies to be used for their empire's needs. There was no malice in their actions, no cruelty for the sake of cruelty. It was simply that we did not matter to them. We were not even worth their consideration. That indifference, the sheer, unfeeling emptiness with which they treated us, was the hardest thing to bear. It wasn't the blows that hurt the most, though they left bruises on my body. It wasn't the hunger or the exhaustion, though they gnawed at my spirit. It was the fact that we were nothing more than tools in their eyes. They did not care whether we lived or died, whether we suffered or thrived. Our pain was nothing to them, as unimportant as the dust that covered the ground beneath our feet. I learned quickly that the Mongols had no time for empathy, no space for compassion. They were focused on one thing: survival and expansion. Everything else was secondary, including the lives of those they conquered. We were part of the process, just another phase in the machine of war. And that was perhaps the most painful realization of all, that we were disposable, not out of hatred, but because we were simply not worth the soldiers' attention. We existed only to serve, and when we could no longer serve, we would be cast aside, forgotten, and replaced with someone else. As I lay there each night, staring at the cold, dark sky, I could hear the soldiers' songs drifting through the camp, proud and full of triumph. But I no longer heard them as I once might have. They were not a celebration for me. They were a reminder of the vast chasm that separated us, the conquerors and the conquered. And in that silence, in that space between the music and the suffering, I found the true cruelty of my situation. It was not the whips or the chains, but the indifference that surrounded us, that hollow space where we were invisible, where our lives meant nothing, where survival was the only thing that kept us from disappearing entirely. The empire, vast and endless, stretched out before me, its reach seemingly infinite. It was a machine, a colossal, grinding force that absorbed everything in its path, leaving no trace of the lives it consumed. I had once believed in the notion of a homeland, a place where I was rooted, where my life held meaning. But now, as I moved from one outpost to another, shuffled along like an unnoticed part of the landscape, I began to understand that this empire had no boundaries, no true end. It was a sprawling, unfeeling system, its endless march swallowing everything in its wake. And I, in my smallness, in my powerlessness, had been absorbed into that machinery, another cog in a vast, impersonal wheel. Time had become a blur, each day indistinguishable from the one before. I no longer marked the passing of hours, for what did time matter in a world where every moment felt the same? The endless movement, the ceaseless routines, the grinding monotony of my existence, it all merged together into a single, overwhelming blur. My identity, once clear and sharp, began to fade. Who I had been, who I was before the Mongols came, these thoughts felt distant now, like a memory from another lifetime. I was no longer a daughter, a sister, a woman with hopes and desires. I was simply part of the empire, a nameless face in a sea of others who moved with the same rhythm, carried by the same tide. Each time I was moved from one place to another, the feeling of erasure grew stronger. The outposts we were taken to were all the same, cold, functional, and utterly devoid of humanity. They were not places for life, but for work. The routines were brutal, the tasks menial and exhausting, but they were meant to keep us moving, to keep us busy, to keep us from thinking too much about what had happened to us, or what might happen next. We were no longer individuals, no longer human beings with thoughts and feelings. We were just workers, cogs in the machine, and the only thing that mattered was our ability to keep moving, to keep serving, to keep existing. The outposts were scattered across the empire, each one more functional than the last. Some were simple camps, set up to house soldiers and slaves for a time. Others were larger, more permanent settlements, where tasks were carried out in a cold, methodical way. There was no place for joy, no space for connection, only the endless repetition of work. The soldiers moved with purpose, giving their orders with quick, sharp commands, while we moved with them, following their lead, never stopping, never questioning. The work we were given was always menial: cleaning, carrying, serving, tasks that required no thought, no creativity, only the ability to endure. The sense of purpose was absent. We simply existed to serve, to obey, to remain functional. It was through observation that I learned the ways of the Mongols, how to move, how to act, how to survive. I watched their language, their gestures, their eyes, looking for any clue that might help me understand the rules of this world I had been thrown into. The Mongols spoke with precision, their words short and to the point, their bodies rigid with purpose. They had no time for niceties, no space for feelings. To them, there was only the mission, only the conquest, only the expansion of their empire. They saw everything, and everyone, through the lens of utility. And so, I watched, and learned, and became one with the rhythm of their world, speaking when spoken to, moving when instructed, and always keeping my head down. Over time, my role in the empire solidified. I was no longer a captive in the traditional sense. I had become a fixture, a part of the system. I moved when they moved, worked when they worked, and slept when they allowed it. My days were filled with tasks that required little thought but much endurance. I became skilled in the art of survival, in the delicate balance of being unnoticed, of doing my work without drawing attention, of existing without significance. I had no voice, no name, no identity. I was not even a person anymore. I was a function. My existence had been reduced to this: moving, serving, existing. And yet, this was my life now. I had no choice but to endure. The greatest cruelty, I began to understand, was not in the punishments or the physical labor. It was in the stripping away of everything that made me who I was, everything that made life worth living. I no longer felt the desire to connect with others. There was no space for it. We were all so broken, so immersed in the routine of survival, that to form any bond would have been a risk. There was no time for such luxuries. The soldiers had no need for us to be more than bodies, more than laborious. And so, we became nothing more than that. We existed to serve them, to work for them, to move in unison with the machinery of their empire. And still, the empire stretched on, ever expanding, consuming all in its path. I had no idea where we were going, no sense of what was beyond the next outpost, the next camp, the next march. It didn't matter. I was part of it now, a small cog in an unending wheel, and my fate was not my own. My role was clear: endure. That was all I could do. Endure. And so, the days and months passed, my identity fading further into the background, swallowed by the relentless force of the empire. I no longer wondered what might have been. I no longer dreamed of the life I had lost. I had become what the Mongols had made me: a tool, a servant, an extension of their will. My life was no longer mine to control, no longer mine to shape. I had become part of the endless march of the Mongol Empire, moving forward with no thought, no purpose, but to survive. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. The day my ownership shifted once again felt as though it was simply another step in a journey I had already ceased to understand. This time, it was different. The man who now claimed me was not just a soldier. He held a higher rank, his position within the Mongol ranks marked by his refined clothing and his unspoken authority. He was a leader, a man who commanded respect with a single look, and his power rippled through the camp, noticeable in the way others deferred to him, the way his words were carried out without question. When he looked at me, it wasn't just as a captive, but as a tool, an object to be used. This was not the first time I had been traded or passed between men, but something about the shift in ownership now felt more final, more cold. The soldiers and the lower-ranking Mongols had at least treated us with the pretense of control, a semblance of power. But this man, he wasn't interested in pretending. He saw me as a function, a tool to serve him, to fulfill his needs. My new life became defined not by who I was, but by what I could do for him. My existence, once filled with faint remnants of hope and memory, was now only about servitude, about cleaning, about serving, about doing without acknowledgement. I moved through my days in silence, my purpose clear. There was no question of dignity, no space for my own wants. I scrubbed the floors of his quarters, tended to his belongings, prepared his meals, and stayed close, always within arm's reach, never allowed to be seen or heard. There was no room for me to be anything other than what I was, a tool. I became invisible, not just to others but to myself. I learned to make myself small, to move silently, to exist only when needed and only for the specific task at hand. When I wasn't needed, I was forgotten. And it wasn't just the physical labor that defined me now. My role had grown more invasive. As the new owner's possession, I became something more than a servant. I became an object to be used. In his eyes, I was not a person with feelings or memories. I was a vessel for his desires, and those desires were brutal. The world I had entered, the life I had been thrust into, was one where women like me were expected to serve not only with their hands but with their bodies. It was part of my role as a captured woman in the Mongol Empire, something I had been forced to accept. My body had become just another tool, just another piece of the machinery that powered the empire. He would come to me as he pleased, and in those moments, I felt a numbness descend over me, as though the very idea of being touched, being used in this way, had been beaten out of me over time. I had learned that to fight back, to resist, would only lead to more suffering, more punishment. There was no escape, no relief, no hope of kindness. I had no value beyond the use I provided. I had learned to keep quiet, to keep my body still, to let it happen and endure the weight of it as best I could. If I could not be silent, if I could not remain still, the punishment would be swift, and it would be worse than what I had already known. And so, I learned not to cry, not to fight, not to speak. Every time he came, I reminded myself that it was the price I had to pay for survival. I had learned that there was no dignity here. There was no space for my humanity. There was only the endless cycle of work and submission, of existing without acknowledgement. The more I remained quiet, the less pain I felt. It was the only way I knew how to survive. As time passed, my new role solidified. I was no longer just a captive who served, who cleaned. I had become something more symbolic in the eyes of the Mongol Empire. My body, my labor, and my submission were a part of their conquest, a representation of their dominance over all they had captured. And it wasn't just about survival for me anymore. It was about fulfilling the empire's symbolic need. I was expected to bear the Mongol seed, to have children, to give birth to the next generation of warriors, of subjects. In the Mongol Empire, the children of conquered women like me were not seen as individuals. They were seen as another victory, another part of the symbolic conquest. A child born of a conquered woman was a testament to the empire's strength, to its ability to absorb and control everything it touched. My body, my very existence, was not just for the service of the empire now. It was for the creation of more bodies that would one day serve, too. I was a part of their future, not because I mattered, but because my child would. There were no promises for the future in the life I led now, no hope that the world would ever be different. I was marked by this life, by the ownership that shifted and changed, by the way I had been reduced to nothing more than a tool, a piece of property. My body was no longer my own. It was a symbol of the empire's power. And as I carried out my duties, day after endless day, I wondered if I would ever be free of this, if I would ever return to a time when I could be anything other than what the Mongols had made me. But those thoughts were fleeting. What mattered now was survival. What mattered was enduring whatever came next. There was nothing left for me to do except live through it, through this endless cycle of work and submission. In the end, that was all I could hope for, to survive and, perhaps, to fade into the background until the empire had no more use for me. The pain, the exploitation, the degradation, these were the marks of my life now. My body, my soul, my identity, all were shaped by the empire, and all that mattered was the role I had to play. I had been swallowed whole by the Mongol machine, and I would remain there, as part of its endless march, for as long as I could endure. Childbirth, like everything else in my life under the Mongol Empire, was a mechanical process, an act of survival more than anything else. The pain of it was sharp and brutal, but it was not mine alone. It belonged to the empire, to the expectations placed upon me, to the role I was meant to fulfill. When my son was born, there was no sense of joy or relief, no connection to the life I had once dreamed of. There was only the weight of his existence as yet another cog in the empire's machinery. His birth was not celebrated as a new life, as a new beginning, but as another piece of the conquest, another link in the chain of dominance the Mongols had forged across the land. He was not born as my son. He was born as the empire's son, a symbol of their enduring strength and power. To the Mongols, he was not a child of love, of hope, or of any future I could have imagined. He was an extension of their conquest, a living, breathing representation of their control over everything, even over me. My motherhood, my bond with him, meant nothing in the face of their dominance. He was born to serve, to be molded into whatever role the empire saw fit. And though I held him in my arms, though I whispered his name in the dark, I knew that he would never be more than a reflection of the Mongol machine. He was not allowed to be his own person. He was simply another tool to be shaped and used by the empire. As the years passed, the child grew, and with him came the inevitable shift in ownership. I had already been accustomed to the idea of being passed from one owner to another, but this time it was different. The death of my owner, the man who had held my body and my existence in his hands, left me without direction. He had been my master, my controller, but in his death, I became nothing again. The child, no longer useful to the Mongol army, was left behind. He was discarded as though he had never mattered. To the Mongols, he was just another abandoned piece of property, another loss in their endless march of conquest. His existence, too, had meant nothing. And I, his mother, was left to bear the weight of that loss alone, an invisible, forgotten part of the system. The death of my owner, the abandonment of my child, stripped away the last remnants of my humanity. I had already been reduced to a tool, a body, a vessel for survival. But now, I was nothing more than a shadow, an anonymous part of the empire that continued to move forward, one conquest at a time. I had no family, no connection, no history. I was a blank slate, moving through a world that had no place for me, where I was nothing more than a function, a worker, an object. And so, I continued my journey, moving from one place to the next, from one outpost to another. The languages of the lands I passed through became part of me, though I never once spoke my own tongue. I learned the harsh, guttural languages of the Mongols and their subjects, words that meant nothing to me except the ability to serve. My identity, my voice, was lost. I could no longer remember the sound of my own language, the rhythms of the home I had once known. Each new place required new words, new ways of communicating, but they never felt like mine. They were just tools I used to exist, to survive, to serve. In time, the masters changed, but the role remained the same. The empire's endless expansion meant that I was always moving, always being passed from one master to another. There was no real difference between them, no real connection. They were all the same, distant, indifferent, using me until they had no further use for me. I had become nothing more than an object, a piece of property with no identity, no history, no name. It didn't matter to them who I had been before. What mattered was what I could do, what labor I could provide, and when I could no longer serve, I would be discarded. The cycle never ended. Then, one day, as I moved through a camp, performing the same menial tasks I had done 1,000 times before, a soldier looked at me. There was something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, something that reached into the depths of who I had once been. For a brief moment, I thought I saw the shadow of the person I used to be. The daughter, the woman who had once had dreams, who had once known love. But it was gone in an instant, like a fleeting memory that slips away before you can grasp it. The soldier said nothing. He did not approach me. But for a moment, he saw me, not as the object I had become, but as a person. And that brief recognition, that moment of humanity, was enough to break me. It was the only recognition I would ever receive, the only acknowledgement that I had once been someone. But it was a reminder of just how far I had fallen, how completely I had been erased. The person I had once been, the woman with a name, with a history, was gone. The empire had taken her, had stripped away every trace of her. And in her place, there was nothing left but an anonymous tool, an object to be moved and used at the will of those who controlled the machinery of conquest. The soldier never spoke to me again, and the moment of recognition faded into the past. But it stayed with me, a faint echo of what I had been, a reminder that once, long ago, I had been a person. And in the silence of my existence, I carried that memory, even as the empire continued its endless march forward, swallowing everything in its path, including me. The years stretched on, each one blending into the next, until time itself lost its meaning. My fate, like that of so many others, was not one of survival, it was one of absorption. I was absorbed into the Mongol system, a system that did not care for individuals, did not recognize names, did not remember those it consumed. It was a vast, unyielding machine, and I was just another part, another cog that turned without hesitation, without recognition. There was no survival here. There was only being used until there was nothing left of you. As the days passed, I felt the slow erosion of myself. The woman I had once been, strong, defiant, with a name, with dreams, was fading, replaced by a hollow shell. I no longer recognized the reflection I saw in the water. My face, once bright with the hope of life, was now worn and tired, marked by the weight of endless labor, by the years of unacknowledged suffering. My body moved automatically, mechanically, as though I were not truly present in it anymore. I had lost the capacity to remember what it felt like to be whole, to feel joy, to feel anything at all beyond the raw, numbing endurance of existence. The Mongols had not just taken my body. They had taken my soul, piece by piece, until nothing remained but the hollow figure that wandered from camp to camp, serving without thought or feeling. My life, my existence, was never recorded in history. The empire did not care about me. I was one of countless others who were swept into its tide, one of the thousands whose names would never be remembered, whose stories would never be told. We were invisible, forgotten the moment we became part of the machinery. There was no place for us in the annals of conquest. The empire's victory was written in the blood of the conquered, but we, the silent casualties, were erased. We were not worth recording. We were simply part of the cost, just another consequence of the Mongol invasion. And when I die, as surely I will, it will be without ceremony, without recognition. There will be no monument raised in my name, no words spoken in memory of me. I will fade away, as countless others before me have, lost to time and to the relentless forward march of the empire. The empire will not remember me, for I was never anything more than a tool. My death will be just another quiet moment in the vast expanse of conquest, unmarked and forgotten by all except those who used me. If I have descendants, they too will forget me. They will not know my name, not know what I endured, not know that I was ever a person. My blood, my flesh, will live on in them, but my legacy will be erased. The empire has no place for legacy unless it is of its own making. My children, if I ever had them, will be born into the same world of erasure, their lives shaped by the same forces that shaped mine. They will serve, just as I did, and when they are gone, their names, too, will fade into the forgotten corners of history. I will not be remembered. I will be a shadow, a distant memory that never existed except in the cold, indifferent world of the Mongol Empire. The truth of it all is that my fate is not unique. It is shared by thousands, maybe millions, of others. Women like me, men like me, all caught in the unstoppable force of empire building, all reduced to nothing but tools in a larger system. We were not special. We were not marked for greatness, not chosen for anything other than our ability to serve. We were just in the path of the empire, swept along by forces much larger than ourselves, forces that cared not for our lives, our loves, or our losses. We were casualties of conquest, anonymous and forgotten. And in that shared fate, there is a cruel truth. We were not individuals. We were not remembered. We were just part of the process, part of the great, unstoppable force that shaped the world in its own image. We were absorbed, used, and discarded, and when we faded away, we left no trace, no legacy. The empire lived on, But our lives, our stories, were lost to time, erased from history as though we had never existed at all. And that is the fate we share. The fate of being consumed by something far greater than ourselves, something that takes and takes, leaving nothing behind but the empty silence of forgotten lives. In the eyes of the Mongol Empire, I was nothing more than a tool, valued not for who I was, but for what I could do. My worth was determined by my ability to serve, to bear children, and to fulfill the empire's needs. I was a body to be used, a vessel for labor and reproduction, and nothing more. My existence was shaped solely by my function within the empire. I could clean, I could cook, I could endure. And when I could no longer endure, when my body no longer served its purpose, I would be discarded, as if I had never mattered. There was no escape from this world. The empire's system was designed to be inescapable. It was not meant to be outrun, not meant to be resisted. It was a force far too vast, too relentless, to be stopped by the actions of a single person, a single life. I was meant to endure, to move through the motions of my days without complaint, to serve without thought of anything else. The idea of escape was a fantasy, a dream for those who could still imagine a life beyond the empire's grasp. For me, there was only the brutal, unending truth of survival. And survival meant submission. It meant accepting my role as a cog in the larger machine of conquest. The years bled together in a haze of work and silence, and as I moved through my days, I realized something terrible. My story would never be told. My life, my struggles, my suffering, none of it would be recorded in the annals of history. History belonged to the conquerors, to the generals and kings who built the empire, to the men who led armies and claimed victory. But women like me, those of us who were used and discarded, were lost to the pages of time. Our names were erased. Our lives were unimportant. We were invisible in the grand sweep of history, our stories overshadowed by the victories of men who cared little for the women who bore the weight of their empire. I had become part of the empire's infrastructure, a cog in the machine that made the conquest possible. Every task I carried out, every moment I endured, was part of the greater work of empire building. I was not a person. I was a tool, one of many, easily replaced when I could no longer serve my purpose. My labor, my suffering, contributed to the expansion of an empire that would stretch across continents, devouring everything in its path. But I was never a part of that empire. I was never meant to be. I was just an object, a function, a piece of the system. The truth of conquest, the part that no one tells you, is the quiet, unrecorded suffering of women like me. We are used by the empire, shaped by it, and when we can no longer serve, we are discarded and forgotten. Our names are never spoken. Our stories are never told. We are not remembered, except as part of the machinery, as part of the infrastructure that made the empire what it was. The true cost of conquest is not found in the victory songs or the monuments to generals. It is found in the silence of the countless women who bore the brunt of the empire's demands. Women whose lives were consumed, whose identities were erased, whose bodies were used and then abandoned. And so, I moved forward, step by step, my life swallowed by the machine of conquest. I bore my children, served my masters, endured the unending cycle of work and submission, knowing that my story would never be remembered. My worth was not found in my dreams, in my past, or in my humanity. My worth was found in my ability to serve, to endure, to fulfill the empire's needs until I was no longer needed. And when that time came, when my body could no longer bear the strain, I would be forgotten, just another casualty of conquest, lost to history, lost to time.